In a cruel world where nobility only makes you a bigger target, Kim Yohan dies and reincarnates as Yohan 8, a low-ranking knight in a powerful family. No system, no overpowered abilities, no easy mode, only the harsh medieval reality. Get strong or die. With the lesson, the only person you can trust is yourself, Yohan realizes that money and power are the only things that guarantee survival. This is the Wandering Knight's Survival Manual, a brutal story of survival and ascension. This world is a place where the blood of the weak is spilled and consumed by the strong. In the middle of the forest, they spot prey. A man tells Sir Johan not to forget what he was taught. He needs to stay calm and shoot. The protagonist tries to follow the step-by-step instructions, but ends up breaking his bow. Because of the noise, the prey gets scared and runs away. The man gets irritated, saying he told him to take it easy and asks how he managed to break his bow. Johan explains that the bow broke very easily, and that maybe it happened because it was very old. But the man, looking at the bow, asks what the protagonist is talking about, since he had bought that bow brand new about a week ago. In addition, the man points out that he had already had a bad feeling ever since the protagonist suddenly wanted to learn how to hunt. Not to mention that the protagonist is a noble, so the man does not understand why he wants to become a hunter. He points out that he could learn swordsmanship instead of hunting. Johan thinks about it for a moment and explains that swordsmanship only makes money when you are employed. The man says maybe so and asks what employment is. Johan laughs, saying it is nothing, and tells him to forget it since they need to go somewhere else. The protagonist thinks that he needs money in order to survive in this rotten world. Johan 8's birth name Kim Yohan. After dying unexpectedly in an accident, he reincarnated in a new world. Being born as a noble was not so bad, but now he is the worst of the worst in the family hierarchy. Inheriting fame and wealth is something he cannot even dream of. If he is very lucky, he will not be dismissed and kicked out by his brothers during the power struggles, but the biggest problem of all was the man notices something and tells the protagonist to wait because there is a pack of wolves just ahead. He shoots an arrow to scare them, and the wolves start running away. The theme of the world where the protagonist had reincarnated is an extremely realistic medieval era, because in this world, not even the dead can rest. Johan asked whether those dead men could be from their village, but the other man explains that it is very hard to know. But one thing is certain, the weak are nothing more than prey for the strong. This makes him even more irritated because he already knew that perfectly well, and to avoid becoming prey in that era, he needs money. When he first arrived in that world, he had wanted to awaken or have some incredible ability. Ever since he was little, he would cry and get angry, asking where his system was, because in every story he saw when he was alive in the other world, the protagonist always had a system. Eventually, he learned that such things do not exist there, so he changed his goal. His new goal became money, because if he can get a lot of money, he can leave that territory and do whatever he wants. He can become a merchant, or even a farmer. Money is everything, and no matter the amount, he will pick up any little coin he finds. While he is caught up in that madness, the older man asks him to take a look over there. He shows him a medicinal herb he had warned him about before, called Little Devil Herb. It is excellent for stopping bleeding and increasing alertness, and hunters must have a lot of knowledge. But before the man can even finish explaining, the protagonist pulls out the herb, saying that it must be very expensive. He stores the herb away, saying he will sell it for a great price later. The man notices a pouch on the ground and tells the protagonist that he dropped something, asking whether it is an herb pouch. The protagonist holds it and says it is not his and that someone must have dropped it there. But the protagonist's friend says that is basically impossible because they are the only ones who go that deep into the forest. But suddenly he is surprised, thinking that maybe that could have happened. They hear a roar and right after that a cry for help. The two run off, saying there is someone up ahead. The wolf howls keep growing louder and louder. And as soon as the two get closer, they see a little girl up in a tree, surrounded by a large pack of wolves, begging for help. He also realizes that the little girl is Robert's daughter. Adele asks why she is so deep inside the forest. The hunter shouts that there are too many wolves and they cannot handle them alone, so they need to retreat and ask for reinforcements. But without thinking twice, the protagonist runs toward the pack. Joseph tries to stop the protagonist, saying that this is far too dangerous, because those are not ordinary wolves. They are known as man-eaters, highly prepared predators. Johan says it is all right because he has a plan, explaining that he will draw the attention of all the wolves while Joseph rescues Adele. Joseph cannot believe that the protagonist is offering himself as bait to save a mere commoner. But the protagonist is excited, with a smile on his face, because if he had known this would happen, he would have tried a little harder to learn how to hunt, since he had not imagined that this place would be a gold mine. He starts counting and reaches at least 10 wolves, and thinks that if he can sell all those pelts, he will make a fortune. That is why this is great. He has found the geese that lay the golden eggs. Joseph is surprised and asks what kind of nonsensical swordsmanship the protagonist is using. Johan is merely swinging his sword with no coordination whatsoever, and the wolves try to attack him. The protagonist uses his sword to defend himself, but one monster sinks its teeth into it and manages to break it easily. With nothing left to defend himself, another wolf finds an opening and bites Johan, leaving Joseph terrified by everything happening. Meanwhile, at the same time, in the Eights territory, in the village of Baltradin, the Eights family's territorial inspection group is passing through. The people who live there are trembling and completely filthy. The concubine, Madame Eights, is bothered by the odor coming from the people there. The first son, Philip Eights, also does not seem very pleased with everything he is seeing. The lord of the territory, Gessen von Eights, points out that it is the same stench as always, and that the countryside is truly hell. Philip calls out to his father, saying he is sorry, but he does not see the protagonist anywhere. Unable to believe that he dared to be absent during the territorial inspection, he asks his father whether he should send soldiers to find him. Gessen tells Philip to forget Johann, since there is no point looking for that idiot, because if he dies out there like that idiot mother of his, it will make no difference. As they are walking, the Lord notices something that catches his attention. He asks why there is a pile of straw stacked at the entrance of the village. A villager apologizes to the noble and explains that those are the remains of the protagonist's training, and that they are there because they are an unpleasant sight. Gessen becomes curious, asking how a pathetic worm like the protagonist is training. But as soon as he sees the result of the training, he is horrified. The punch marks on the tree are deep, and most of them are completely destroyed. The Lord asks what the hell happened there. Meanwhile, in the middle of the forest, the wolf is still on top of the protagonist, trying to bite his arm, but Johann uses a bit of strength and his arm forms muscles so strong that not even a wolf's bite can scratch him. Johann thinks that this is it because trying to use a sword really is not his style. He throws the wolf away and stands up. See, now he is going to fight his way. Survival of the strongest. To avoid becoming prey in that era, he needs money. And to obtain money, he needs powerful and absolute strength strong enough to transcend human limitations. With his bare hands, he creates so much pressure with his attacks that Joseph is terrified by what he is seeing. The wolves begin to be overpowered and destroyed one by one with extreme ease. It is a true bloodbath. Joseph is still completely lost because everything he is seeing is impossible to believe since that strength is absurd. But the protagonist is just smiling and having fun, saying that this must be worth a good amount of money. Johann had no choice but to accept that life in that world was not easy. The second-ranked and third-ranked members of his family always mistreated him, saying that he was not legitimate and needed to be killed. His higher-ranked brothers constantly tormented him, blinded by their status while spitting insults and beating him whenever they felt like it. Even after a great punishment, the two would go around threatening him again, as if there were not a single second of peace. Johann naturally came to understand how cruel that world was. Even if he were beaten to death like that, no one would care about him. The only person he could count on was himself, and so he thought, what did he truly need in order to survive in a medieval world as cruel as that one? Unfortunately, the protagonist had an advantage over the people of that era. His past life as a civil service exam candidate studying day and night to get jobs. Because of that, his mind possessed knowledge that the people of the medieval era could not even dream might exist. So he decided to use that to his advantage. The science of physics and highly intensive training were applied to himself. After his training, he was eating walnuts, cabbage, beans, quail, eggs, and other things. A commoner woman went up to him and asked why he was eating discarded food, but the protagonist did not understand what that woman was talking about, because those foods were essential, perfect for building a nutritious and balanced diet. He created a training regimen based on modern knowledge of physics and practiced a close-range martial art. Then, his endless training accumulated, and after several years, the man had transformed into a true war machine, a monster capable of destroying trees with a single punch. With each training session, his body gained more and more strength. Whether that strength was a blessing from a god or a trial he had overcome, no one ever found out. Returning to the present, he breathes a sigh of relief when he sees that the entire pack had been annihilated by him. Joseph grabs Adele and asks whether she is hurt, then says he is relieved that she is safe. The poor little girl is completely terrified and can only cry. After everything is resolved, Joseph scolds the protagonist, saying that what he did was unbelievably reckless. Even so, he was proud to see the protagonist fight against a pack of wild beasts without hesitation for the sake of a young girl. Because of that, he was moved by that honorable action and, on behalf of all the residents, expresses his sincere gratitude. But Johann had not done all of that for the little girl. He was like a true demon of greed, holding the wolves in his hands while laughing and asking which one would be the most valuable. Johann looks at Joseph and asks whether he said something, but Joseph simply ignores it, saying it was nothing. After picking up some wolves, the protagonist goes over to them and asks whether Adele is all right or if she got hurt. The little girl says she is fine and was not hurt thanks to him, so she would really like to thank him. But while she is speaking, she senses a terrifying, murderous presence behind them. The two look over and see a huge wolf in front of them. Joseph shouts that it is a monster, grabs Adele, and tells the protagonist that they need to run because it would take an entire army to defeat a monster like that. But since the protagonist seems addicted to combat, he starts smiling because he had thought this was just an ordinary medieval world, but in reality, even monsters existed there. He asks that huge monster whether it is the leader of the pack. He apologizes, saying that he ended up eliminating all of that monster's subordinates and that there was no helping it, since wolf pelts sell for a very high price. The wolf continues staring at the protagonist. Johann stares at it like prey, but that does not matter. The monster tries to attack, and the protagonist says that whatever that thing is, its pelt must be worth much more than all the others combined. He picks up a stone and hits one of the wolf's eyes, causing an injury. The protagonist gets irritated when he sees that he ended up damaging the wolf's pelt because that will lower the price. The monster grows even angrier and lets out a deafening howl. That sound echoes inside the protagonist's head. He realizes that something is wrong and ends up losing his strength, fainting in the middle of the fight. Suddenly, he begins to see a battle scene where two people are fighting and one of them is eliminated. The protagonist wakes up startled and asks what just happened and where that monster went. He looks back and sees Joseph and Adele sleeping safely. This makes him feel a little relieved, seeing that apparently everyone is fine and safe. He picks the two of them up in his arms, saying that even though he does not know what happened, more monsters may still appear, so they need to retreat. Before leaving, he looks once more at all the wolves he had defeated, saying that he really wanted those wolf pelts, but there is no helping it, and next time he needs to bring a carriage to carry all his valuable items. As he approaches the village, he notices that the lights are still on, and perhaps they are searching for Adele. And even though it had not been his intention, he still managed to save her, so maybe he will earn some points with his father. He imagines his father reacting as if he were proud that he defeated an entire pack alone, and with that, naming him as his successor. But he soon returns to reality and says there is no chance of that happening, though maybe he might at least become a guard. If that happened, he would no longer have to worry about food. As he gets a little closer to the village, he sees several torches lit. His family is standing before him, and the protagonist is surprised by that. Philip shouts, asking where he has been and how he dared to disappear on the day of their father's inspection. Johann is surprised because he had forgotten that it was today. His father gets down from his horse, calling him an insolent worm. Johann kneels, saying that he truly went through unavoidable circumstances, but his father tells him to shut his mouth, asking how he had the nerve to ignore him, and says that because of that his head will be split in two. The protagonist gets irritated because he barely managed to return alive and now has to listen to these insults, in addition to having lost the wolf pelts, which means that life really is not a bed of roses. However, he realizes that he can turn this into an opportunity. Now it is time for supreme flattery. He shouts to his father that he did not miss the inspection on purpose. He was late because he was saving the residents in the forest. Adele's father runs out to see his daughter and holds her in his arms, saying thank God she is safe, because he was worried and had been searching for her everywhere, and now he is relieved. The protagonist asks his father whether he is seeing this, because that girl was surrounded by a dozen man-eating wolves in the forest, and he fought to save the child and defeated all the others. He could not take part in the inspection, but he believes he fulfilled his duty as the son of a noble house. He bows, telling his father that if he is forgiven just this once, he will continue doing his best for the safety of the territory. And it would also be great if he could receive the position of captain of the guard. Philip is surprised by that request, but the protagonist thinks this was a masterstroke. If he were the interviewer, he would hire himself without a second thought. The protagonist's father starts laughing, asking whether he would be the future captain of the guard, but then asks where all those wolves are, questioning whether the protagonist really believes he would believe that whole story without any proof. Johann is surprised, but says that it is not a lie because he even managed to encounter the great shadow wolf. His father becomes even more irritated and tells him to be quiet, asking how he has the nerve to lie like that, because now he will have his mouth ripped out. The protagonist asks whether he wants a duel or something like that because, if so, he agrees. That way he can prove his skills. He takes a deep breath and thinks that even though he does not like that guy, he is still his father, and he did not want to fight for that reason, but there is no helping it now. Gessen laughs and says he would very much like to see just how skilled his son is. He tells the protagonist to raise his sword because they will duel with weapons. Upon hearing that, the protagonist is shocked because his father had never taught him how to fight with a weapon. They prepare for the duel, and the Lord tells his son to draw his sword, and even got a morning star as a bonus. His father gets irritated and asks Philip to lend his weapon to the protagonist. Philip hands over the weapon and warns Johann that it is still not too late for him to beg for mercy, because that is the only way he can get out of that situation alive. The protagonist asks why he would beg for mercy when he has done nothing wrong, not to mention that a man cannot run away from a battle. He gets into a fighting stance and tells his father to move, saying that he would really like to learn something from that duel. Gessen realizes that something is wrong, and the protagonist thinks that this is better, because if he can show everyone how skilled he is, then everyone will have to acknowledge him. That way, he will be able to prove his worth. He charges at his father, who is startled because he sees a monstrous aura coming from Johann. The two clash their blows, but the protagonist's sword ends up breaking. However, the force had been so great that it made the Lord fall to his knees. This makes Gessen even angrier, and he charges forward, cursing the protagonist, who easily dodges the attacks. The Lord keeps attacking, asking how the protagonist dares to insult him in front of everyone. The people realize that the Lord is fighting seriously, and apparently, he really wants to end Johann's life. Gessen asks whether the protagonist knows why he was never taught to wield a sword. It is because even then, he would still be useless, with or without a sword. No matter how hard he tries, he will never be able to surpass him, because that territory is his and his alone, and no one can take it from him, not even the Emperor or anyone else. The protagonist, who is slightly injured, feels lost, wondering what his father is talking about and thinking that perhaps he has lost his mind from drinking too much. But that is not so important right now, since the blood running down from his forehead is getting in the way of his vision. Philip shouts for his brother to be careful, but that only distracts the protagonist. When he turns his attention back to the fight, his father's axe is already about to hit him. All the villagers become worried, but he manages to block the attack at the last second. However, his sword finishes breaking. He realizes he is lost, and he drops to his knees in front of his father. Gessen points at him, telling him to know his place, and that if he ever sees him again, he will crush the protagonist's skull. As soon as the family leaves, the villagers go over to the protagonist. A little later, inside the church, Father Valberg is furious, saying that the Lord was extremely unfair. The protagonist grows worried and asks the priest what will happen if someone hears them. Valberg says he does not care about that because he is from the Vatican, so it does not matter to him. After all, a gentleman should have honor. How could he treat his own son that way? The protagonist says it is all right because at least he is still alive, but the priest is still indignant, saying that it was complete nonsense because the Lord was wearing full armor and alcohol had certainly corrupted his brain. The protagonist takes a deep breath, saying that perhaps that is the reality of the situation. He never learned how to wield a sword, but he had not imagined he was that weak. Valberg explains that Gessen has been in many battles, inherited the family's techniques, and has experience, so it is only natural that the protagonist lost. After all, he heard that Lord Britz in the neighboring territory eliminated 300 servant soldiers on his own. The protagonist is surprised to hear that and comes to the conclusion that perhaps equipment really is important. He had thought he could defeat his drunkard father since he had driven off a large black wolf. Upon hearing that, the priest is surprised and asks whether that is really true, whether he saw a black wolf in the forest. Johann says yes, and that Adele and Joseph saw it too. After hearing the story, the priest begins to pray. Because of all that, he is surprised and asks what that has to do with anything. Valberg explains that since ancient times, black wolves have been considered taboo, and priests call them harbingers of death. According to centuries-old stories, black wolves appeared carrying death and blood. The protagonist takes a look at the book and apologizes, saying that he does not believe in those things, but perhaps the black wolf was a premonition of the duel with his father. Valberg agrees, saying that this really could be true, but the protagonist should not worry. The stories about black wolves are only old tales, and perhaps he is trying to help him because he is a good person who puts others above himself. But the protagonist does not know what to say, because the truth is that he only cared about the money others would give him. Meanwhile, near the Eights territory, in the barony of Britz, cries for help and the sounds of swords spread everywhere. A mother, holding her child, begged for her life, but it was no use. The soldiers ask why they keep trying to run away, since they are going to die either way. And in the end, that is very cruel. Eliminating everyone in the territory and charring the bodies is not something they should care too much about because they are only doing their job to receive their gold. One of the servants goes over to Karamav, saying that the mercenaries have finished the cleanup and that here is the ring with the Brit's family seal. Karamav holds the ring and crushes it in his hand, saying that he had high expectations because he heard Brits had managed to eliminate 300 servant soldiers on his own, but he did not last even 2 attacks and was not even worthy of being called a toy. He, known as Karamav, the Sword of the Holy Empire, herald of his imperial majesty and recoverer of seals, decrees that he will punish all corrupt nobles, just as his imperial majesty desires. Everyone who stands with the emperor will be rewarded with endless riches and honors. Then he orders his subordinates to eliminate, rob, and burn everything and everyone they find in their path, because the Eight's territory is next. The same battle that the protagonist had seen when the wolf appeared before him repeats once again. The battle between the two people grows more and more intense, and suddenly, one of them loses his head. The head falls to the ground, and as soon as the helmet opens, the protagonist's face appears. He wakes up completely terrified and realizes that it was only a dream. Ever since he saw the black wolf, he has been having the same nightmare for days. He remembers what the priest had said because, since ancient times, black wolves were known as a sign of death. The very existence of that creature is considered an ill omen, a creature that spreads blood wherever it goes and brings death to others. The priests even call them harbingers of death. Johan tries to convince himself that this is only superstition. Even the priest said it was just an old story. After all, it is not as if he did anything to the black wolf, but then he remembers that he hit the wolf right in the eye with a stone, and that makes him increasingly worried. But he decides to forget that whole story, and what happened has happened. Now it is time to stop these redundant thoughts and go train. He goes to the top of a mountain and begins his training. But suddenly 2 people arrive, calling the protagonist a useless worm. They are ranking 2 and ranking 3. Ranking 2 asks whether the protagonist has already forgotten what their father said, because he said that if the protagonist does not want to die, he had better avoid drawing attention. And even after they beat him up, the protagonist acts like he is something special, and apparently he only barks and never bites. Hitting a board or a tree will not make him stronger. That is just arrogance. Ranking 3 also continues mocking him, asking whether breaking logs is supposed to be impressive. Ranking 2 points out that it is only a cheap trick, as if someone inferior like the protagonist could have real strength, and that he can keep dreaming about the position of captain of the guard because their father would never choose a useless piece of trash for that role. The protagonist simply shrugs all of that off and grows more and more irritated. He gently touches the tree, but his overwhelming strength destroys the entire tree. The 2 idiots are frightened by this. Watching the tree fall split in half, Johan looks at them and asks whether they just said something, because they can repeat it a little closer. The 2 start running, saying they are fine and that there is no reason to come any closer. And besides, they are going to tell their father everything about what just happened. Johan thinks they are nothing but idiots, wondering how they can live so carefree because they should be preparing to survive. However, he decides to let it go, since there is no reason to worry about others, and it is time to return to training. Philip says those 2 are right because their father has no intention of giving the protagonist a position. Johan says he already figured as much, but just considering the fact that he was not killed, it could have been much worse. Philip asks whether the protagonist is really not disappointed, but Johan simply says that life is like that and that he will have to find another way to make a living. But Philip tells him the truth, saying that their father is afraid of Johan. The protagonist stops for a second, and Philip continues, saying that he is very strong, and that is undeniable. That strength is a threat to the Lord since he wants obedient sons like Philip himself. But the protagonist is different and insists on living according to his own principles. And precisely for that reason, the Lord believes that one day, the protagonist's monstrous strength will take everything he owns. Just as he also surpassed their grandfather and took the throne, he fears that the same thing will one day happen to him. Johan says that this is just a bunch of nonsense, but Philip tells his servant to bring it immediately. As soon as they open the sack, the protagonist is surprised and asks what that is. His brother explains that they are common clothes, and a long sword of unknown origin that had been stored in the castle. Johan points out that it is just a leftover breastplate and nothing more, but his brother asks whether the protagonist had had his eye on those things for a long time. He points out that he is not like their father, and is not foolish enough to discard someone as strong as the protagonist. Because of that, he promises that when he becomes Lord in the future, he would be greatly honored to appoint Johan as captain of the Guard of Eights. But until that day comes, the protagonist needs to promise that he will never abandon his training and that he will avoid causing new problems as much as possible. Johan shouts that he was not the one who started any of the problems, but his brother bids him farewell politely and leaves. The protagonist, still startled, realizes that this is exactly the same armor from his dreams. If he wears it, he will die the same way he has died several times in his dreams. He holds the breastplate and thinks that, for some reason, even without proof, he feels that he can overcome all of this. He puts on the breastplate saying that either way he needs equipment if he wants to win. Night falls and the tavern is full of people. They are saying that it cannot be true and telling them to stop making things up, but one person insists that he is telling the truth because the protagonist managed to eliminate 50 wolves. But he left all the pelts behind because, as a knight, he must not be obsessed with money. He wielded his sword solely to save Adele and Joseph. He is so virtuous and pure that he is the very image of an ideal knight. The other people agree, saying that the protagonist has more chivalry than that drunken, womanizing lord. They begin asking why that pig has not died yet, since he drinks enough to fill a river, while they talk about this with someone who is merely listening to everything. The villagers are hoping the protagonist will manage to cut off that idiot drunkard's head, but he must have held back because he is his father. The man places his cup on the table, and Robert arrives saying that the drinks are on him today, so he can drink as much as he wants. The hooded man asks why. Robert says it is because the protagonist saved his beloved daughter and is now considered the Knight of Justice. The other people ask the hooded man who he is, since they have never seen him walking around there before. The hooded man begins to laugh, saying that they were mocking the Lord in front of a complete stranger, and that apparently the residents of that place fear nothing. He says he found that story very interesting and asks them to tell him a little more about Johann. Meanwhile, the protagonist thinks that Philip will appoint him as captain of the guard when he becomes lord, so his path to success has finally been paved. However, all of this is still a surprise since he never imagined his brother had such a good heart. Suddenly, he sees a man sitting outside and thinks that he is definitely drunk, and that the future captain of the guard cannot ignore an intoxicated citizen. He approaches the man saying that if he sleeps outside there, he will definitely catch a cold and asks where his house is, since he can help take him there. But the protagonist notices that something is strange, because something cold is approaching. Suddenly, another person appears behind him and places a dagger against his neck. He does not understand why this is happening. Johann raises his hands while thinking about who this person could be, and maybe it is even an assassin sent by his father. But he quickly dismisses that idea, since the Lord would probably prefer to eliminate him with his own hands. He thinks that perhaps he could have been sent by Madam, but he dismisses that too, since his brother would not do that, especially after proposing that he become the future captain of the guard. This only leaves the protagonist even more lost, since he cannot understand why that guy is doing this. He decides to ask the hooded man what he wants and whether he is doing this for money, saying that he can give him everything. He just needs to lower that weapon. But the man says that if it is money, he has more than enough. Johann becomes even more confused because if that guy is not doing this for money, then he has no idea what he wants. The hooded man calls the protagonist by name, saying that he will ask a question, and if the answer is not to his liking, then he will eliminate him right there. Johann grows worried because a question has appeared out of nowhere, and the wrong answer could cost him his life. But he calms himself down because he once managed to reach the second stage of an interview with a major company in his previous life. So he only needs to answer perfectly and he will survive. The hooded man says it is time to begin. He notices that the protagonist has a very good body, which makes it hard to believe he is the son of that idiot pig, and asks whether he really is the Lord's son. The protagonist is confused because that man has his life in the palm of his hands, and that is the question he asks, but he truly does not know what he should answer. Johann points out that sometimes a lion can be born from a pig's bloodline. The hooded man falls silent and the protagonist becomes frightened, wondering if it is possible that he answered incorrectly. But the mysterious man begins to laugh, saying that he loved that answer. Johann says that if that is the case, then he could let him go, but the hooded man says no, because now the protagonist belongs to him. This man is Kogal, the greatest assassin in the Empire and master of poisons from the Nasos Guild. He perfected his swordsmanship through countless assassinations, and because his movements resembled those of a serpent, he eventually became known as the Venomous Serpent. However, even he had his problems. He was unable to find a successor to inherit his swordsmanship. He searched everywhere, even in the Assassin's Guild, but unfortunately he found only insignificant worms who could never succeed him. Some showed potential, but the chosen man says that he would rather die than stain his honor by learning the skill of an assassin. Kaigal accepted his request and eliminated the man without mercy or pity. More than 30 heirs of knightly families were eliminated by Kogal's hands. All of them chose to die in the name of their honor. Growing increasingly impatient with the delay in finding a successor, Kaigal visited the Empire's witch. The witch says that Kaigal is known as the Venomous Serpent, the one who grants a peaceful death to all, and that the disciple he seeks resides in Eight's castle, in a small and abandoned rural territory. He is one of the sons of that drunken and treacherous lord. Kegel asks whether the witch is truly certain that his successor is in that backwater, where a single gold coin could buy half the land. The witch laughs, saying that she is certain, and that if her prophecy displeased him, then she could return his money. But Kegel says that perhaps a curse would fall upon him if he took coins from a witch, so he will believe her prophecy. Kegel wanted to believe. He had spent many years searching for a successor, and his time was almost up. However, even when he had already set foot in the Eight's territory, doubts still filled his entire body. With every step he took in that place, he wondered whether someone worthy of becoming his successor was truly there. And even if the witch was correct, if he did not like that so-called successor, he would eliminate him on the spot. Returning to the present, he introduces himself to the protagonist, saying his name and that he is also the master of the Nessos Guild. He points out that he has no time to waste, so the protagonist must become his successor. The assassin asks the protagonist to choose. Either he can be eliminated right there, or he can learn the swordsmanship of an assassin, because those are the only paths he can take. The protagonist simply asks how much. Kegel is confused and asks him to explain. The protagonist asks how much he will have to pay to learn the swordsmanship. Kegel says he is not charging anything. The protagonist is surprised to see that this man will personally teach him swordsmanship, a guild master with excellent skills, and all of it for free. This is incredibly lucky. He grabs Kegel and starts calling him master, asking why he took so long because he has been waiting for someone like him his entire life. Kegel, surprised by this reaction, points out that his experience is that of an assassin, and that just by learning it, the protagonist will lose his honor and become the disgrace of a knightly family, so he may be disowned by all of them. But Johann interrupts his new master, saying that he does not care at all about honor or shame. He only wants to learn swordsmanship, and he begs his master to start teaching him. Kegel ends up agreeing and thinks that this is the first time he has ever seen someone with this kind of attitude. Johann goes straight to his main objective. He tells his master that he heard him mention having a lot of money, so by any chance, he would like to know whether, if he learns the swordsmanship very well, he could receive an allowance. Kegel realizes that his new disciple truly is different from all the others. Meanwhile, at the castle, the Lord is leaving, saying that the inspection is complete and that he will withdraw for a while. Philip and Madame see him off, asking him to travel safely because they will take good care of the castle, but the two are not on good terms with each other. Madame says that no matter how hard Philip tries, that castle will be hers, but he says that is just nonsense, because the next lord of the castle can only be him. Gessen says that he is already irritated with them because the two of them only fight day and night so they can do as they please. Philip tells his father that the protagonist still has not returned and asks what they should do. But the Lord becomes extremely irritated and shouts at his son, telling him never again to waste a lord's time talking about that boy because that weakling is of no interest to him. Philip is startled and apologizes, saying that he understands, but he is still worried about his brother, wondering where he is and what he is doing now. At the same time, in the forest near the castle, Kegel says that he would like to verify just how dangerous the protagonist is. Johann asks his master to lend him a sword because all the swords he owns tend to break frequently. Kegel hands a sword to the protagonist but thinks that he is very reckless and does not like anything the boy has shown so far, and perhaps the best thing to do is eliminate him right now. Kegel asks whether the protagonist is ready, and he says yes, but he is in a hand-to-hand combat stance, using his bare hands. The assassin is confused, wondering whether that boy really is the son of a knightly family, because that posture is completely wrong, and apparently, he really will be another one who dies. Johann asks his master whether he really needs to use swordsmanship or if he can fight however he wants. Kegel points out that he can fight however he pleases, whether with his fists, rocks, blades, or anything else. The protagonist laughs, saying that if that is the case, then they can begin. With his absurd strength, he makes a move and the assassin blocks his strike, but both swords explode at the same time. At that moment, Kegel realizes that all his doubts were unfounded, because that brat is incredibly strong. Even with the sword broken, the protagonist keeps attacking with his own fists. The assassin dodges the blows but realizes that all that pressure in the air came from a single punch. And if just one of those punches had landed, then all his muscles and bones would have been crushed. The air pressure alone is enough to cause a small cut on his nose, because it does not feel as though he is facing a human, but rather a true lion, a fearless monster that charges forward without hesitation, searching for its prey. However, there is still a great difference between them. Kegel goes on the offensive and begins using his swordsmanship skills, moving like a serpent. The protagonist asks what those movements are and where he is going, since he changes direction every second. Without the slightest chance to defend himself, the protagonist ends up being struck and thrown to the ground. But Johann quickly gets back up. His master is surprised, saying that he hit him with the hilt of his blade, yet the protagonist did not even faint, and that this is absurd. If he had been born 1,000 years earlier, he would certainly have been considered a legendary hero. Johan feels flattered and thanks his master for the praise. But since life is not a bed of roses, Kegel points out that the protagonist has a critical weakness, and at this rate he will die regardless of his strength. Johan is startled and asks exactly how he will die. His master says that the protagonist is unable to control his strength, and that very strength is what will kill him. Johan refuses to believe it since it is not as if he is hitting himself. Kegel shows several other swords and says that if the protagonist is so confident, then they can face each other again. But this time, the rule will be different. The master says that if the protagonist manages to break his master's sword instead of his own, then he will receive gold as a reward. Johan becomes blinded upon hearing the word gold and charges at his master, saying that he had better keep that promise. But as soon as the two blows collide again, the protagonist's sword is completely destroyed. He remembers exactly what happened during the fight with his father and realizes that the exact same thing has happened again. His master asks whether the protagonist understands now, because he lost control of his own strength once more. That is why he needs to learn how to control his power, otherwise he will die. Johan notices that a piece of his sword is stuck in his armor, pointed toward his heart. He removes the sword fragment and asks whether his master made that fragment lodge there on purpose. Kegel says yes because something like that is very simple for someone proficient with a sword. The protagonist thinks that he finally understands. He needs to control his strength. That way he can learn and avoid his death, since he wants to become the future captain of the guard of his territory. His master points out that if he can restrain his power and control it perfectly, then something like this will be possible with a single movement. The master strikes the protagonist and creates a cut in his armor. Johan is surprised because his master managed to cut his armor with the sheath of his sword. Kegel asks whether the protagonist saw that because if he is able to control all his strength, he will be able to cut anything, even if he is not carrying a sword. The master grows excited, saying that when the protagonist manages to control his power properly, he cannot even imagine how strong he will become. Kegel points his sword at his disciple's face, saying that this is enough, and now they can go straight into training, but he needs to emphasize that it will be extremely difficult and that he may even end up dead, asking whether he is truly ready. Johan, excited, says yes and asks his master to begin immediately. At dawn, Johan returns to the city with his face completely swollen. He remembers the training and thinks that perhaps he is learning to control himself, but it is very difficult. At least he has learned not to break his sword, but when he will learn real swordsmanship is still a mystery. While returning home, he notices elves in front of the castle entrance. He approaches and asks who they are and why they are standing there. One of the elves asks whether the protagonist cannot see that this is a restricted area and orders him to leave immediately. But Johan asks who he thinks he is to give orders like that. The elf merely laughs, saying that they are mercenaries hired directly by His Imperial Majesty, known as the Wolves of ActionToon. They are a mercenary guild. The protagonist gets excited because he needs a job and asks the mercenaries how much they earn. The other mercenaries begin laughing, asking why he's asking that and whether he really wants to become a mercenary because their pay is incomparable to what a captain of the guard would receive, since they earn 2 gold coins per job. Johan is impressed. The mercenaries notice that the protagonist really likes strength training, but point out that this would only make him an easier target, because what truly matters is skill. The protagonist agrees with them, thinking that he has never seen a single gold coin in his life. So this is much better than being captain of the guard, and maybe he needs to change careers. While they are talking, Karamov approaches, and the protagonist senses an extremely threatening aura inside him. This makes him try to attack unconsciously, but all the other mercenaries draw their swords and point them at the protagonist. Confused, he tries to understand why he tried to grab his sword, even though he did not mean to do it. One of the servants shouts that this was a great insult, daring to try to draw his sword in front of Lord Karamov, and that it must be punished with immediate decapitation. But Karamov says it is all right and asks who the protagonist is. Johan bows, showing respect, and introduces himself, saying his name and that he belongs to the House of Eights. Karamov removes his helmet and stares at the protagonist. Johan thinks that he put his hand on his sword without even realizing it, because he has never felt that way before, not even when he saw the Black Wolf or when his father tried to eliminate him. That man's killing intent is suffocating, as if he were prey placed in front of an alpha predator. Karamov simply asks the protagonist to move because he is in his way. However, Johan cannot do anything because he is barely managing to stay on his feet. The other mercenaries slap his back, saying that he almost soiled himself. Karamov enters the castle, and the mercenaries tell the protagonist to be more careful next time, although there probably will not even be a next time. Akabali asks his commander whether it is really all right to let the protagonist go. Karamov points out that he does not want to cause a commotion on a beautiful day like this, at least not yet. Johan, outside, keeps looking at them and thinks that a knight of the Empire is there, but he still does not know why. Philip becomes desperate when he learns that Karamov has arrived because he does not know what such an important figure is doing in a place like that. As soon as he reaches the entrance, he gives his greetings, stating his name, and says that he will be the next lord of that house, asking what such an important man is doing there. But Madame is already there, saying that Karamov is a very handsome man, and introduces her son John, saying that he is the one who will be the true lord. She points out that if she had known someone as magnificent as him existed, she would have married later, and now they can enter the castle. But Karamov simply ignores everything and continues walking. She asks him to wait and questions whether he is listening. Karamov removes his helmet and sits on the throne, asking where Gessen is. Everyone is surprised by that attitude. Philip says politely that regardless of how great Karamov's reputation may be, speaking his father's name that way is somewhat inappropriate. Madame says that in any case, he is the greatest knight in the empire. So there is no problem with him calling the lord that, and since she is the lady of the house, she will take care of Karamov's reception, asking whether Philip has any objection. Philip thinks that this wicked woman is using the opportunity to make her son the next lord. But Karamov orders everyone to be quiet immediately, leave, and bring him a drink, because he will wait inside the castle until Gessen returns. Meanwhile, in the middle of the forest, the protagonist was training with his master, but he ends up getting distracted as he remembers his encounter with Karamov. His master tells him to stop being foolish and focus on the battle, hitting him with several daggers. Kygel points out that if those daggers he threw had been coated in poison, the protagonist would be dead now, and asks why he is not concentrating. Johan explains that recently, knights claiming to be the Emperor's personal royal guard visited the village, and obviously there is something strange behind all of it. This is the territory of the Eitz family, and even if they are Imperial Knights, they should not be able to close the gates and control entry and exit like that because none of it makes sense. Kegel points out that whether it is suspicious or not, what could the protagonist do about it? Since Karamov is the Emperor's direct knight, he is the strongest warrior on the continent, the core of the Holy Empire's power, and even the armor he wears is legendary. Johan asks whether Karamov is stronger than his master. Kegel thinks about it for a moment and says that if he had to face Karamov, he would look back and run without hesitation. The protagonist does not quite agree with that, saying that his master will only know the result of a fight when he faces his opponent head-on, but his master hits him on the head, telling him to be quiet. After all, he is just a fool and needs to learn to know his place. At the moment, the protagonist cannot even control his own strength, which makes him nothing more than a mediocre boy who does not even know the basics of swordsmanship. Johan simply says he will continue and draws his sword. His master takes a deep breath and says, "That is fine," telling him to advance. They continue fighting, but the result never changes. However, the protagonist does not give up even once. Johan keeps advancing but starts questioning himself as to why his attacks do not work, since his master is not even using a real sword, only the sheath. So why is he unable to cut it? He senses the flow of power because he cannot swing the sword uncontrollably. He needs to transfer the flow of his strength into the sword and concentrate it at the tip. When he swings his sword, he slowly begins to understand what controlling his strength means. Even his master notices that the dull sound of the protagonist's sword is beginning to become sharp. They continue intensifying the fight more and more, and the protagonist finally understands that if he combines everything he has learned so far with the right amount of strength, Kegel realizes that this is becoming far too dangerous. The protagonist finally manages to understand the technique, cutting his master's sword in half. Johan celebrates because he has finally evolved. Still happy, he points out that now he completely understands how it works, and that it was not that difficult. His master thinks that perhaps it was some kind of luck and calls out to the protagonist, saying that this time he will not hold back, and asks them to train once more. But Johan has incomparable strength and speed, and with a single movement, he leaves his master unable to react, ending up defeating him for the second time. Kegel cannot understand what exactly that boy's existence is, because he had taught him nothing beyond how the protagonist should control his strength. Yet he still managed to freely use the serpent's tongue technique. He perfectly absorbed a technique he had only briefly seen on the first day they met. In addition, the master realizes that the protagonist not only managed to absorb the technique perfectly, but is also using it more effectively. The old assassin's experience is screaming that, unless a miracle occurs, the protagonist has already become someone he can no longer defeat. The master of the strongest assassins guild in the Empire, known as the Poison of Nasos, whispers to himself, "What an insane boy." Kagal, seeing that the disciple has already surpassed the master, tells the protagonist that all his teaching is now finished, so he will leave at sunrise. Johan, still confused, says that all he has done so far is learn how to use the sword and asks whether his master really needs to go. Kegel points out that the protagonist already has everything he needs. As much as he hates to admit it, Johan has already become stronger than him. The master says that he is already satisfied as long as his swordsmanship does not disappear from the world. But now the protagonist needs to live his life as he wishes, because he has already worked hard enough. A short while later, they sit around a campfire and he asks his master whether he's really leaving. Kegel says yes because he never stays in one place for very long. Johan asks why his master decided to become an assassin. Kegel says there is no simple answer to that, so it is enough to say that it is simply his nature. Johan takes the opportunity and asks his master whether he knows anything about bad omen. Kegel asks whether he is talking about the Black Wolf, and the protagonist answers yes, because he recently encountered the Black Wolf and then dreamed that he was being decapitated. So when they met and his master held a dagger around his neck, for a moment he thought Kegel was his bad omen. Kegel points out that if he had finished off his disciple, that would have been a bad sign. However, misfortune takes many forms. So before he leaves, he would like to give him some advice. A weapon suited to his strength. He will need, at the very least, Dana's steel to withstand all that physical power. The protagonist is confused and asks what kind of material that is. Kegel explains that Dana's steel is a metal imbued with magic and only exists in the form of legendary relics. Its method of creation was lost, so it can only be mined from ancient ruins. Because of that, weapons made with Danas are extremely rare, and only a few exist in the entire world. The protagonist says that it must probably be very expensive if it is that rare. His master points out that even if he saved money his entire life, he would not be able to buy it. In truth, it is not something that can be bought with money. Johan is confused, asking why his master recommended something that is basically impossible for him to find or buy. Kegel says he was simply telling him to find a weapon that fits his situation. But the protagonist asks whether his master is hiding his true intentions because he is an assassin. Kegel explains that this is not the case, and tells the protagonist to stop being so paranoid, since he keeps mentioning his master's profession all the time. He continues explaining that even the color of Dana's steel is unusual, so if the protagonist ever happens to see someone carrying Dana's, he needs to run far away and not even look back, because those who do not know their own limits tend to die very early. Johan says he promises to keep all of that in mind and asks whether his master is leaving now. Kegel tells his disciple to engrave his next words deep into his soul. He must not face opponents he cannot defeat. So if something is too dangerous, he needs to run. And if a fight is inevitable, he needs to use any means necessary to kill his opponent. And failure is unacceptable, since it could cost him his own life. If he follows those rules, he will probably have a long and prosperous life. His master continues, emphasizing that he must not die and must do everything in his power to stay alive. Kegel says farewell and begins to leave. The protagonist starts thinking about his master's words. If it is dangerous, he needs to run. If running is not an option, he needs to kill and always survive. He promises to keep those words in his heart and never forget them for the rest of his life. Meanwhile, at his family's castle, Madame is still trying to please Karamov, asking whether that drink is to his liking. But the knight throws the drink away, saying that it tastes like rotten piss, and tells her to remove it from there immediately. She laughs, saying that it is a very expensive drink, and asks whether he really did not like it. But he continues acting arrogantly, saying that it is a shame. She says that the only better alcohol is in the Lord's room. In addition, she points out that he must be tired after his journey, and asks what he thinks about going to a comfortable room instead of sitting there. After all, the Lord's room is very comfortable, and she is sure it will be to his liking. In addition, she suggests that it be just the two of them, because they could have a wonderful time together. Karamov begins to lose his patience and tells her to simply disappear. She becomes irritated and says that they do not have much time, so she would like to begin his reception because the Lord will arrive very late that night. Karamov loses the last of his patience and stands up, saying that he is tired of this, so he will accept and enjoy it. He begins by crushing Madame, saying that the entertainment known as divine punishment is the best of all. Philip, who is watching from behind the door, is horrified by this. Meanwhile, the protagonist is returning to the city and notices that everything is in chaos. He asks why the village is on fire. It is so chaotic that even the Lord, who is far away, asks why the village is burning. One of the servants says he does not know what is happening, but apparently the incident seems very serious, so the Lord must return immediately. A short while later, he reaches the entrance, and the mercenaries laugh, saying that he finally appeared after they made a small mess. And apparently the Lord seems just as stupid and slow as he looks. They point out that that pig should be a little faster, since Karamov is not a very patient man. As soon as Gessen enters the palace, he sees everyone eliminated on the floor. His family, his wife, and his children, all of them, are lying there. Karamov walks over to him, saying that the Lord is late. Gessen becomes furious and shouts, asking what he thinks he is doing. Karamov explains that Gessen is guilty of the crimes of attempted assassination of the emperor and high treason, and that, as decreed by his majesty, the House of Eights will be eradicated. The Lord shouts at the knight not to talk nonsense because this is nothing but a purge, since he is placing false accusations on him just to execute him. Gessen grabs his axe and charges forward, saying that he will not allow Karamov to do whatever he wants. Karamov begins drawing his Danus steel sword and orders them to sound the trumpets, recover the seal of the Eights family, and eliminate everyone in the territory in order to wipe that land off the map. As soon as the trumpet is sounded, the mercenary army begins invading the city. The city is basically destroyed, and one person still remains. The priest is on his knees, and one of the soldiers says that the priest is damn resilient, asking what is so difficult about saying where that pig's bastard son is hiding. Even so, the priest remains silent, and the elf says that if that is the case, then he will meet his god personally. But before he can do that, Johann appears and cuts off the elf's arm, saving the priest. Valberg is relieved to see the young master right in front of him. The protagonist unties him and asks what is happening. The priest says he does not know because Imperial soldiers are killing all the villagers, and it is very likely that the Lord has already been eliminated as well. The protagonist is surprised, and the priest continues, saying that this is not all because they are burning the entire village to destroy everything. Johann thinks that he needs to return to the castle immediately, but before he goes, he hears someone crying and recognizes that voice. He begins walking over there and sees Adele kneeling on the ground, desperate. He is relieved to see that she is safe and says that it is dangerous to stay there, so she needs to go with him. But when he looks ahead, he sees something terrible. Adele was crying in front of her father's body. The protagonist stares at that and remembers the smiles of the two of them when he saved Adele. He looks back and remembers the residents who used to smile whenever they saw him, all dead on the ground. He holds back his tears, and hatred begins to take over his soul. Johann tries to comfort Adele, saying that she will be in danger if she stays there alone, so she needs to stay with the priest. As soon as he leaves Adele behind, he grabs his sword and walks toward the castle. The priest asks where he is going and begs him not to do this and to flee immediately. But the protagonist simply remains silent and keeps walking. He arrives in front of a stake bearing his father's head. On the sign, it was written that Duke Gessen had been executed for the crime of treason against the emperor, and anyone who recovered his corpse without permission would be punished for the same crime. Imperial Knight Karamov. The soldiers see the protagonist saying that he is that pig's bastard son because they thought he had run away, but apparently he came back to die. Johann cuts down the stake with his father's head and steps on the flag. The mercenaries become irritated, ordering the others to attack and eliminate that boy immediately, but the protagonist, consumed by fury at seeing the villagers pay for a crime they did not commit, begins eliminating the entire mercenary army in front of him. As he walks through the bodies and blood, he starts thinking about why he is doing this. Why is he returning to the castle? The priest is right, he should be running away. If he goes back, he will be eliminated. But suddenly he hears a familiar voice calling his name. He sees Philip on the verge of death. Philip is surprised to see the protagonist alive and asks why he came back, telling him to flee immediately, because if he stays there, he will die too. Philip gathers his last strength and, with his entire body heavy and trembling, hands the helmet to Johann, saying that he wanted to give it to him when he became captain one day. The protagonist holds the helmet in his hands and remembers his master's words. He must not face opponents he cannot defeat, and if it is too dangerous, he must run. He thinks that his opponent is the Imperial Knight, and even his master told him to run without looking back, but there is still the final rule. If a fight is inevitable, then he must fight to kill. He puts on the helmet and says that this inevitable fight is now. He opens the castle door and looks at the mercenaries, who are surprised to see how he got inside. The protagonist begins eliminating all the mercenaries, shouting Karamov's name and ordering him to appear immediately. He was slaughtering the army like a true beast. Karamov appears, saying that the fleeing son of Eights really did survive, and asks whether the protagonist was the guy who stood in front of the castle that time, and whether his name is Johann. But the protagonist says that he is not in the mood to chat and asks his opponent to think of him only as a man consumed by hatred. Karamov says that he could have kept running away, because if he had done that, he could have lived a long life. But apparently he does not care that much about his own life, and since he wants to die so badly, then he will make that happen. He tells Johann to come at him. Johann says that he does not need to tell him twice because he had that in mind from the very beginning. The battle between the two begins, and every blow causes a shockwave. Every movement is calculated with surgical precision, and the battle between them grows increasingly intense and dangerous. but the Danish blade has an absurd advantage. Karamov manages to cut the protagonist's sword in half. The protagonist picks up several other swords and keeps advancing, but the result is always the same. All of them are cut with ease. Karamov keeps pressing forward and tries to attack, but the protagonist dodges the blows, causing him to cut the pillar. The Imperial Knight thinks that this is very interesting because that young boy is far better than Brits. Johan throws some of the mercenaries toward his opponent, but the Imperial Knight cuts the mercenary in half, thinking that this is truly amusing. And the more amusing it is, the better the battle becomes. The two continue fighting, and thanks to his absurd strength and his master's training, the protagonist manages to wound part of Karamov's arm. He throws away his broken sword and grabs another one from the ground. Karamov looks at his arm and thinks that the protagonist actually managed to pierce his Danish steel armor, wondering how that is possible. Johan grabs another sword from the ground, and the Imperial Knight thinks that this is impossible because humans are incapable of piercing Danish steel. So who really is this guy? The protagonist has only one objective and charges forward again. The two continue exchanging blows, but with each strike they trade, Karamov becomes more impressed, saying that this is unbelievable because he has never heard of such absurd physical strength before. However, the Imperial Knight realizes that the protagonist only remembers death and only has strength. He finds an opening and thinks that the protagonist only makes wide swings without caring about defense. He manages to graze the protagonist and thinks that this was expected because he cannot block a simple thrust. He is swinging the sword by instinct without a single proper technique. Karamov is surprised to see that Gezin never taught that boy real swordsmanship, but the reason was obvious right in front of him. That boy is extremely dangerous, so the Imperial Knight needs to end this immediately. Karamov thinks that if the protagonist uses that stupid wide slash again, then all he needs to do is block it at the start because his sword can cut through anything, and that way his precious head will go flying. Johan begins exactly the movement the Imperial Knight had predicted, but then something surprising happens. Karamov cannot distinguish what is happening. His master's swordsmanship. With his master's perfect swordsmanship, combined with his absurd strength and speed, he manages to break his opponent's stance, causing a massive wound, but his sword breaks there, so he decides to use what he does best. With his own hands, he lands a punch so powerful on Karamov that even his Danish steel armor is dented, causing an extremely severe internal injury. The Imperial Knight, who was once seen as someone relentless, is now on his knees about to die. Karamov thinks that this is Kegel's technique, assassin swordsmanship, and apparently, that boy had been hiding his skill the entire time. The knight looks at the protagonist, who's standing in front of him, and realizes that he had completely lowered his guard. But now it is already too late. The wound he suffered in his torso is becoming more and more serious. Johan removes his helmet and throws it on the ground, asking why Karamov did all of that. The Imperial Knight explains that it was all for his Imperial Majesty because the Holy Empire is more unstable than ever. For that reason, His Majesty drew his Imperial sword to correct the Empire, and that sword is known as Karamov. He continues coughing more and more frequently and shouts to the protagonist that he is moved. For decades, he crossed countless battlefields and faced countless knights, but he had never encountered anyone as strong as him before. He asked Johan to join him in the Empire because His Majesty needs powerful talents like him right now. The Empire's endless gold will give him glory. He will receive vast and fertile lands. The Emperor will personally appoint him as his Imperial Knight, so he needs to become the sword of the Empire. Johan thinks about the endless gold, but finds all of this very strange, because this is the life he has always dreamed of. Yet for some reason, he feels nothing at this moment. He looks at Karamov's face and says that he refuses. The Sword Saint is surprised, and the protagonist, still consumed by hatred, says that he does not care about any of that, because the Imperial Knight did not only kill his family, but also eliminated innocent residents, people who had done nothing wrong. Karamov asks whether the protagonist is really rejecting that offer because of mere peasants. Karamov begins acting strangely and shouts that no one cares about the deaths of those insignificant people, then asks whether the protagonist's mother was a low-class commoner. Because they are insects, nothing but pathetic worms. The strong trample and toy with the weak. That is the law of that world. Johan apologizes to his master because he can no longer control his strength. He starts beating the Imperial Knight with all his hatred, asking whether that was not for the Emperor, whether lives have no value, and what makes him think he is so important that he can judge who lives and who dies. Each blow seems to carry the weight of several tons, and not even the knight's perfect and basically impenetrable armor can protect him from every impact. After several blows, Karamov finally stops moving. Johan realizes there is no longer any reason to keep hitting him and stands up. Karamov, with his final breath, says that the protagonist is a fool because he should have accepted the offer, but now it is too late. The one who breaks the Emperor's sword will only suffer from this point on. Johan simply looks at that piece of shit on the ground, already at the end of his life. The protagonist thinks that everyone accepts death casually, and to survive, the only thing he ever coveted was money. But the Empire eliminated everyone in his territory, his family and his neighbors, and all of them were punished. Even if the whole world becomes his enemy, he did what had to be done. No matter what anyone says, he will never regret it or bow before a mad tyrant. And that is how he will live from now on. A short while later, Jane asks once again whether what they are saying is really true. One of the mercenaries says that without a doubt she needs to believe what he is saying, because Johan suddenly invaded, faced all the soldiers, and then, on his own, took Karamov's head. Jane, still unable to believe it, does not know what to say. The subordinate continues, saying that this was the last sight they had of Karamov. She says that if everything he just said is true, then where is Karamov's corpse? Because it should be right there. So how is she supposed to believe such nonsense without any proof? The subordinate says that he does not know either, but he is certain of everything he saw. Another subordinate appears and tells her that the search team is ready. She takes a deep breath and says she will be there soon. She goes over to them and tells them to pass the order to all troops. They need to go after him and eliminate the protagonist as soon as they find him. The target is Johan. He was still fleeing, and she says he is nothing but a filthy traitor who abandoned his own bloodline. In addition, he is the suspect in Karamov's death. So they need to eliminate him if necessary, but they must bring him in at any cost. Some mercenaries finally manage to find him, but they are all quickly annihilated. Jane receives information that the protagonist can pierce Dana's steel with only his own strength, so they must never face him alone and need to remember that they are hunting a living dragon. She orders them to close all routes around the territory so they will be able to make him run until collapse from exhaustion strikes him. But the guards are still paralyzed with fear after discovering that the strongest spearhead, known as the Relentless, has been killed. Jane continues trying to convince everyone, saying that they must take that bastard's head to His Majesty. He remembers the last conversation he had with his brother. Philip had told him that about 500 steps northwest of the hunting grounds he would find his stable. He needs to go there, mount a war horse, and flee, because he needs to survive at any cost. Sometime later, the protagonist manages to reach the stable he had mentioned, but he's already so exhausted that he thinks he might meet his end there. He thought that hiding Karamov's corpse could create confusion, but the search team organized itself faster than he expected. Even so, since his armor can serve as a shield, he should keep carrying it until he has completely escaped from them. As soon as he enters the stable, he sees one of Gessen's war horses. He touches the horse and thanks his brother because, with that help, he should be able to rest at least a little. He thinks about what name he will give the horse because he is very grateful that it was sent as an ally by Philip. One of the mercenaries shouts that he saw something shining over there and is certain it was the gleam of Dana's steel. Because of that, they need to search every inch of that place. That bastard is definitely nearby. Suddenly, another one of them hears footsteps and the protagonist leaps over them on the horse, carrying Karamov. The mercenaries shout that he is escaping on horseback. The commander of that troop orders them to shoot immediately and not let the protagonist escape. But thanks to Karamov's armor, he manages to get away. Then he rides his horse all night and quickly shakes off the search team. Upon arriving deep in the Black Forest, he gets down from his horse and digs a grave, saying that it is probably deep enough, and that even though that guy was a degenerate, leaving a person unburied is not a very good thing. But either way, his armor seems very expensive. In addition, the sword is light and sturdy, made of Dana's steel. As soon as he draws the sword from its sheath, he notices that it has an ancient inscription. The inscription says, "I am the one who recovers crests." He thinks that the sword is probably referring to family crests, and even its name is intense. Because of that, he feels that the sword itself is already his natural enemy, but for now, he will take the sword with him, while the armor will be buried together with its true owner. He thinks that this is a true waste, but carrying that armor around will not help him. He will definitely come back later to retrieve it. A short while later, he finishes burying the corpse and the equipment, and that should be enough. He thinks that Karamov was the Imperial Knight, and when news of his death spreads, the entire empire will come after him. The countless knights who follow him will also try to subdue him. He remembers that Karamov said he would suffer from that moment on. However, the protagonist thinks that his life had already been nothing but suffering long before he smashed that idiot's face in. Still, he has no idea what he should do now, because the House of Eights has been burned down and he was not able to bring a single coin. In addition, he cannot even sell that rare armor, not to mention that he is so exhausted that his arms are trembling. Because of that, he needs to rest a little and then think about what to do. But before he can rest, he senses a murderous aura and prepares to fight. The black wolf from before has appeared again. Johan, nearly fainting from exhaustion, prepares to fight, saying that that bastard had to show up right now because he can barely stay on his feet, which means that in these conditions, he has no chance of winning that battle because he can barely hold his sword, let alone face a monster. So his only option is to get on the horse and find a way to flee as quickly as possible. But before he can do anything, he hears the mercenaries shouting that they found the horse and managed to capture that bastard's horse, which means he is nearby. Johan cannot believe they are already that close. Their leader says he heard something and points in the protagonist's direction. And now he is in a delicate situation because there is a monster right in front of him and a search team just behind him. So there is no longer any escape. And perhaps this is his end. But the Black Wolf, instead of attacking him, simply ignores his presence there and completely annihilates the search team as if it were nothing. While the search team screams for help because they are facing a monster, the protagonist does not understand, asking what is happening and whether it is possible that the wolf has not seen him. However, he decides to let it go, since the truth is that the monster is clearing the path, and this is his chance to escape. He also gathers the rest of his strength, saying that he needs to get out of there, because if he does not do it now, he will also become food for that monster. He starts running, climbs onto his horse, and races through the forest. He remembers that the priest always taught him when he was little, the merchants gave him some things to eat, and he even had help learning how to fight when he was young. But all of that was taken from him. He says farewell to Eight's village. The Black Wolf, after annihilating the entire search team, looks at the protagonist running as if it were trying to help him. A little farther away, the guards were still blocking the path, and the protagonist was irritated because the way out was completely blocked. He sits on the ground thinking that now he truly has a major problem, because ever since he fled, he has not eaten or slept, and he has barely managed to do anything properly. He never imagined those guards would keep chasing him for 3 days straight. He has even lost count of how many times he came close to death while trying to escape those bastards who never stopped coming. And because of all that pressure, the protagonist was already reaching his limit, since he barely had the strength to lift his own sword. He stares at the guards while asking himself whether there really is no way to get out of that place. Because if this continues like this, he will simply be captured and executed by all those bastards. Suddenly, he hears a noise and looks back, seeing a trade carriage with an armed escort, and it is probably a traveling merchant's carriage. The protagonist thinks that perhaps he can disguise himself as a merchant, because if he can act as though he is part of their group, he will certainly avoid suspicion. That way, he can use them to get out of all this chaos. Ketna Trading Company. Eldans, one of the guards, calls out to Lord Eldans, saying that there is an extremely well-armed knight up ahead. Gorankan, also a mercenary, says that everyone should prepare for battle. Gamson asks why they should be so afraid of a single knight, because if all 9 mercenaries attack him together, they will finish it quickly. Goran tells Gamson to look carefully because, unlike them, the protagonist is fully covered in armor. In addition, he is mounted on a warhorse, not to mention that he is wearing a helmet and even a cuirass. Gorankan asked whether Gamson can see the sword at that knight's waist because if they look directly at the hilt, they will see a purple glow, which indicates that the sword was forged from Dana's steel. If he swings that sword at all of them, their armor will be split like butter, meaning they could easily be annihilated if they try to face that guy in any way. Gamson, still suspicious, asks whether they are not exaggerating too much, because even if that guy is strong and has excellent items, there are still 9 of them. Gorankan and Goran get irritated with him, asking whether someone can get that idiot out of there because he is getting in the way of everyone's thinking. The two keep hitting him, saying that if he does not know anything, then he needs to stay quiet so he does not cause problems for the others. Eldans tells Gorankan to prepare for them to attack the instant that man does anything suspicious. Eldans says that he will go ahead to observe the situation a little better, and when he gives the signal, everyone must attack. The mercenaries get ready and the merchant gets down and walks toward the protagonist. Gorankan gives instructions to his team, saying that as soon as the battle begins, they need to knock the protagonist off his horse and try to thrust their swords into the gaps in his armor. Eldans greets the protagonist and introduces himself, saying that they work for the Katana Trading Company, so he would like to avoid unnecessary misunderstandings, asking if he may know the knight's name. Johan looks at the merchant and realizes that he is a very observant man. In addition, all the mercenaries were already ready to attack, and the merchant was analyzing every bit of body language the protagonist showed. He realizes that this is very bad because the merchant is already suspicious of him, and perhaps that is because of his current appearance, so the best way to resolve this is to make him lower his guard first. Johan shows his face and wishes the blessings of the gods upon them, saying his name. He explains that he looks so dirty because he was attacked by bandits while traveling earlier, so they do not need to be frightened. He asks whether the merchant could tell the gentlemen behind him who are staring at them not to attack. Eldance begins to laugh, saying that it really was very rude of him, and apologizes, but since he is a merchant, he always has to be prepared for the worst. The protagonist says he understands the situation, and that is why he would like to travel together with the merchants group, because as they can see, he lost all his money in the attack, and if they can give him a little food and a place to sleep, he will be very grateful and will help protect the carriage. Eldance thinks about it for a moment and concludes that the protagonist seems to be a very strong man and also does not seem particularly suspicious. He ends up agreeing and says he has a proposal. The merchant explains that they are heading to Marseille, so it will be a very long journey, and any help is welcome. He asks the protagonist to go over to the other mercenaries and introduce himself. Johan thanks him very much for the help, but thinks that he has no idea where Marcel is. Gorangoran asks what exactly happened. The merchant says that the protagonist is only a traveler and that they will all be traveling together for a while, but even so, they need to keep an eye on that night, because if anything happens, they must not hesitate for even a second to eliminate him. Johan thinks that his plan is going very well, and now all he needs to do is get through that patrol. The carriage continues its journey. A few meters ahead, the mercenaries notice that someone is approaching. As soon as the carriage arrives, the mercenaries introduce themselves as the Wolves of Akaton and say that if they want to pass, they need to cooperate and allow them to conduct a brief inspection. The protagonist thinks that they have finally reached the patrol point and hopes they can get through without drawing too much attention. Eldance introduces himself to one of the guards, saying that they have done business a few times before, so he would like to speak directly with their officer in charge. The guard is startled when he hears the name of the Ketana Trading Company. He thinks that this is the trading company that left its main headquarters in Marseille, the commercial center. The city of Marseille is a place where not even the emperor can set foot without caution. The guard tries to be a little more polite, saying that it is a pleasure to meet him. However, he explains that he is only obeying orders to search for a fugitive trader, so if he can cooperate, it will only take a moment. Johan realizes that those bastards set up that patrol just to capture him, but the first one chosen is the protagonist himself. The guard goes over to him and asks him to remove his helmet and show his face. Johan tries to disguise the situation, saying that he has a special condition on his face. The mercenaries begin to laugh, saying that they do not care about the protagonist's ugly face and ask him again to take off that helmet, or else they may think he is hiding something. Johan realizes that there is no other way and prepares to remove a few more pieces of trash from the planet. But before they can start fighting, Eldance shouts at the mercenaries, telling them to stop immediately. He asks whether they are really suspecting the Katana Trading Company. Normally, the soldiers try to explain that this is not the case because they were only obeying imperial orders. Eldance does not care and asks whether he had not ordered them to bring the officer in charge. In addition, he points out that if the guards try to interfere one more time, he will have no choice but to personally send a direct complaint to their captain at the Marseille branch. Seeing that things are getting a little out of control, the guard tells the others to let them pass. As they are passing through, the guard looks at the protagonist and says that he is very lucky. Johan thinks that he finally managed to get out without having to slice up a few scumbags again. As he leaves, the guards keep looking at him as if they suspect something. A few hours later, in the middle of a forest, the carriage has stopped to rest and spend the night. Gorankan tells everyone to check their equipment one last time because the night watch will be assigned to the recruits. Eldance is inside a tent, analyzing a few things. The mercenaries look at the protagonist and say that he has nothing to do, so he can go to sleep. Johan thanks them and takes off his shirt to use it as a pillow, lying down almost dead from exhaustion, because he never thought he would manage to get a night of sleep. While they are sleeping, a light appears in the forest. Someone is analyzing the entire situation and says that this is excellent, telling everyone to get ready because they need to surround them on the hill and attack them all at once. During the battalion's tactical training, this sergeant successfully carried out a defense-in-depth strategy, defending against a large number of enemies with a limited number of troops. He demonstrated an incredible tactical sense and became an example for the other members on duty. Therefore, he received a reward with a commendation and 5 days and 4 nights of leave. The commander of Battalion Unit Dep6, Lieutenant Colonel Kim Johan if possible. The protagonist becomes extremely excited by this and celebrates, because it was incredible, and maybe life in the army really does suit him. And all of this is thanks to the fact that he studied tactical strategies in advance. However, a backward and highly hierarchical culture, shifts so intense they are deadly, hellish working conditions, and the worst part, pay lower than a goldfish. The protagonist quickly changes his mind, saying that this is not for him, and decides to quit. But the other soldiers explain that he can join whenever he wants, but he cannot leave that easily. Suddenly, the protagonist wakes up a little startled, thinking that it was a dream. He sits up in his bed complaining that he barely managed to sleep because of that dream about the army. He looks at the moon and suddenly notices several arrows coming toward him. He grabs an arrow, stopping it from hitting his face. He thinks that maybe those damn guards are after him again. While thinking that he had gotten to safety, he says that he needs to warn the mercenaries first and shouts to everyone that an enemy ambush is happening. 5 minutes before all of that, Gamson was complaining that only he had to work himself to death, because it would be very fair for that knight to keep watch as well. But Garankin simply tells him to be quiet and do his job, asking whether he really wants them to let a man they barely know watch over everyone's safety. Perhaps Gamson has not considered that, while they are sleeping, that bastard could take everyone's lives and steal their supplies to flee. Gorankin decides to give the little idiot some advice, saying that if he cannot be rational and keeps acting impulsively, he definitely will not last long in this line of work. Gamson explains that he became a mercenary because he did not want to rot away in a village at the end of the world his entire life, because he wanted to live his life as a real man. But if he had known that the Goran mercenaries were a bunch of idiots who could do nothing but freeze in fear before a single night, he never would have joined that stupid group. The two are about to start fighting, and suddenly, the cry of ambush echoes out and enemy arrows fly toward them. Without thinking twice, Gorankin runs to protect Gamson, telling him to stay down. As soon as the arrows stop, Gorankin tells Gamson to call the others, but he simply runs away, crying, completely frightened by the situation. Goran appears, saying that he is happy to see Gorankin safe, pointing out that a rain of arrows also came toward them. He asks where Gamson is, but Gorankin says they will talk about that later. Gorankin asks whether Eldans is safe. Goran explains that the boss is under the carriage, waiting for everything to end. The protagonist arrives with the other mercenaries and takes command, asking them to form a circular defensive line around the carriage, because they do not know which direction the enemy may attack from, and to avoid ambushes, they need to stay together and fight together. But, as always, Gorankin thinks he is the contractor there, saying that they will take care of their part and that he only needs to focus on surviving. They begin distributing shields for the mercenaries to use. The protagonist points out that he has fought in these same situations several times, so he would like a shield to fight with as well. But Eldan says that there is no possibility of that happening, because they do not have enough shields even to defend themselves, so the protagonist should just try to survive on his own. Johan thinks that this treatment has a very obvious reason, since they do not trust him at all. Suddenly, the enemies begin advancing. The protagonist is surprised, asking who those people are because they are not the mercenaries who were chasing him, just some random group of bandits. Gorankin gives the order for everyone to advance and counterattack, but the protagonist thinks that is complete madness, wondering who will protect the carriage if all of them advance at the same time. The battle between them grows increasingly intense. The bandits continue advancing with everything they have to force the mercenaries back since they are outnumbered. Goran tells all his companions to hold their positions as firmly as possible, because giving ground to the enemy is the same as seeking death. But soon he is also struck, and when he is about to die, the protagonist realizes that he can no longer just stand there, and attacks with his sword. The strike is so fast and so clean that the man who was hit only realizes he has been cut when his body begins splitting in half. Even Johan is surprised to see that his opponent was split in two in a single instant. The bandit at the front notices that the marked waves on that sword are absorbing blood, which means it is a demonic sword. He shouts to all his companions that the enemy has a demulata sword, and they ask how a merchant with the demonic sword is safely there and where he came from, because they have no chance of fighting against something like that. Johan smells their fear and shouts, saying his name and that he comes from the house of Yates. So who are they to dare attack him? Gorankin and Goran are surprised to realize that the protagonist is a noble. Johan thinks that he changed the name of his house to Yates, and since it is not exactly Yates, there should be no problems. The bandits say they have never heard of the house of Yates and ask whether that boy really is a noble. Another bandit says that if he is using a demonic sword, then it must not be just any house. That means they will be completely finished if they get involved with a noble house. The protagonist continues pressuring them and points his sword again, asking them to answer his question, or they will regret it now and be killed by that sword. Gorankin's group begins cheering, telling the bandits to think carefully about their answer. The bandit leader takes a deep breath and throws his sword to the ground. All the others do the same and bow, saying that they surrender. Johan sheathes his sword and calls Goran, who now calls the protagonist Lord Johan. The protagonist asks him to tie up all the bandits and kill without hesitation anyone who resists. Goran asks Eldons what they need to do now about the noble matter, because they had thought he was only a traveler with good equipment, and perhaps the protagonist may hold a grudge because they treated him badly, since the proper thing would have been to give him an exclusive cabin from the beginning. Eldans explains that they allowed the protagonist to join them when he asked, and that is certainly something good they did. Because of that, he now needs to calm the situation and tells Gorangaran to just stay quiet and watch. Eldans arrives with a smile on his face and greets the protagonist, saying that he must have had a very difficult night. The merchant thanks him for everything the protagonist did to help him protect his carriage, so he does not know how he can repay this favor. The merchant thinks that if he had known he was a noble, he would have given him a shield immediately. Johan asks what Eldans is talking about because the most important thing is that he is safe and doing very well. The merchant is surprised because the protagonist truly has no intention of asking for any compensation. The only thing Johan wants is that next time, he be allowed to use a shield. The merchant becomes embarrassed and says that certainly next time, he will receive a shield before anyone else. The protagonist laughs and says that this is enough. In addition, the protagonist says that he was thinking of interrogating the bandits and asks whether he could use the mercenaries' help to do that. Eldan says that he is free to do whatever he wants. Goran points out that now that the protagonist's status has been revealed, they would feel more at ease if he spoke a little more formally. One of the mercenaries grabs one of the bandits and orders him to hurry up to the interrogation. The bandit appears before the protagonist, and Johan asks whether he is the leader of that band, who he is, and why he attacked. The bandit explains that they are private soldiers of the House of Brits, a house that was annihilated a few months ago. The House of Brits was suddenly attacked under the pretext that they were plotting treason against the emperor. Those bastards murdered everyone, men, women, children, and even the elderly without any proof. Those who attacked their territory were the wolves of Akaton. They did everything they could to resist, but as soon as that noble executioner joined them, they were defeated and had no choice but to flee for their lives. Goran and another mercenary say that the executioner must be him, the emperor's hunting dog known as Karamav. The bandit bows once more, saying that he begs forgiveness because he committed a crime punishable by death. They did not expect a noble to be traveling with a merchant carriage. The man continues explaining that the imperial army hunted them, saying they were rebels, and those from the north rejected them, calling them cowardly deserters. And although that does not justify banditry, they needed to do something to survive. The protagonist asked whether they were not attacked for any other reason. The man says no, because they were after a carriage from a trading company, since they knew it would be carrying expensive goods. Eldans gets angry, asking whether they do not know that trading companies choose their delivery men based on trust, so he probably has no idea how much they suffer because of looters like them. The mercenaries try to calm the merchant down, and because of all this, the protagonist starts thinking about the entire story the man was telling. Treason against the emperor, and now, thinking about it, when he faced Karamav, he said that everything was for the emperor. Now he completely understands there was never any treason from the beginning. The emperor only needed a pretext to execute the nobles and unleash Karamav across the empire. This is just a load of nonsense, which means that Idiot deserved an even worse death than the one he got. The protagonist looks at the bandits and thinks that they are in a situation basically identical to his own. They are victims of that rotten power. That said, it is also true that they became bandits, so he has no idea what he should really do with those people. Gorankan asks the protagonist what they should do with them, because all he has to do is give the order and they will carry it out immediately. Johan says they should not receive any further punishment, because they have already obtained all the information they needed. Gamson appears out of nowhere, saying that if that is the case, then they can eliminate all of them. But before he can hit one of the bandits, Gorankan stops his attack. Gamson is surprised and asks what he is doing and why he is protecting those people. Gorankan explains that those bandits have already surrendered to the protagonist, so they have no right to punish them, especially someone who abandoned his allies and ran away with his tail between his legs. Gamson ends up agreeing and decides to stay quiet. The bandits begin begging for their lives, saying that they will never do anything wrong again. Gorankan continues waiting, saying that all the protagonist needs to do is give the order and they will execute them all. But the protagonist simply tells the mercenaries to take all the bandits' weapons and let them go. Gamson asks whether he is really going to let them all leave, but the protagonist tells them to listen and says that he understands the circumstances the bandits are in, because they probably had no other kind of work besides bearing arms. But even so, robbing carriages is not something that can be tolerated. After all, he also had to learn skills in order to survive. Eldans is surprised to see that a noble has learned something. The protagonist tells the bandits to look at the mercenaries, asking whether they are not robbing people because they have no reason to. Gorankan introduces the Goran group, pointing out that he is there because they pay well. The protagonist continues, saying that he is letting them live, So they need to learn something useful and use it to make a living. All the bandits and former soldiers bow before the protagonist, thanking him for the opportunity and saying that they will never forget his teachings. Johan says that they also need to leave, since he does not want to get involved in something like this again because he is exhausted and needs a moment of rest. Meanwhile, the Black Wolf is still watching everything from afar, like a guardian angel or a guardian demon, according to the protagonist. Before going to Marcel, Johan's group decides to stop at a place known as Rutsbeck Village to rest briefly, since he is nearly dying from not eating or sleeping properly for almost a week. One of the subordinates goes to the village chief, informing him that Eldans from the Ketana Trading Company has arrived. As soon as the two meet, the merchant is happy and runs to hug the chief, saying that it has been months since they last saw each other. The village chief is also happy, asking whether anything happened on the way. Eldans explains that they encountered a gang of bandits on the road, and points out that ever since the emperor went mad, he feels the bandit situation has gotten much worse. The village chief says that the merchant is a little foolish because if an informant from an imperial faction had heard what he just said, he would be in serious trouble. Eldans laughs, saying that despite all of that, they still managed to transport the goods safely, and it is all thanks to the noble who traveled with them. That boy possesses great bravery, which is impressive. The village chief says that now that the merchant mentions it, a noble also passed through there a few weeks ago, but he was just a nobody pretending to be a noble. So they beat the imposter's face in and drove him out. Eldans nearly dies laughing, saying that the village chief still acts impulsively when he loses his temper. However, this time, he does not need to worry, because the noble himself is a righteous man, and even after protecting the carriage from the bandits, he did not ask for any reward. The village chief is impressed, asking whether the noble really did something for someone without asking for anything in return, because that cannot be true. Eldan simply keeps laughing, and the village chief thinks that Old Fox is not the type to talk nonsense. With bandits appearing everywhere, having a knight of that level around would be very good for the village. In that area, a well-trained knight is strong enough to annihilate an entire group of bandits, becoming a great help to public safety. The village chief gets excited, saying that they arrived at just the right time, and asks whether they would not like to stay there for a few days or even a week to truly rest, since the merchant had said the bandits were causing some trouble. Eldans apologizes but explains to the village chief that unfortunately, he cannot accept that offer. But the village chief insists, saying that this is just an agreement between brothers between the two of them. Eldans laughs and disguises the situation, saying that the two of them really do have the habit of joking and chatting with each other, but the merchant thinks that the sly old bald man is trying to steal his powerful ally. On the other hand, the village chief thinks that that fur coat is apparently trying to get in the way of his business. After they talk a little more, the village chief asks where that precious noble the merchant mentioned is. Meanwhile, the precious noble they were speaking so highly of looks like a homeless man, completely covered in blood because of his previous battles and starving to death. Gorangaran goes over to the protagonist and asks him to accept that gift because it is all the money he was able to obtain. He points out that they sold all the bandits' items and armor, and it is not a fortune, but it is still a good amount. Johan asks whether they took any share for themselves, but Gorangaran says that he was the one responsible for capturing all the bandits, so they did not take any. The protagonist analyzes the situation and returns the money, asking him to divide it among the men in the group. Gorangaran is surprised, saying that he cannot accept that because it is a lot of money. They surrender to the protagonist, and of course, all the equipment should be his. Johan explains that it is all right and tells him not to worry about it, showing that he already took a little money because that is his share. Gorangaran is surprised, asking whether the protagonist is really going to keep only those coins. Johan keeps laughing, saying that it is fine, but inside he is eating himself alive. Handing over the money he had earned with his blood and sweat made him even angrier inside. But between keeping the money and encountering those mercenaries again while alone, spending some money to stay with that group of mercenaries is 1,000 times better. Gorangaran tries to argue so he will not have to keep the money, but the protagonist interrupts him, saying that he did not fight alone. The entire group fought together, and they became brothers in battle. The protagonist thinks that this should be enough to show a little goodwill to the entire group. He says goodbye, saying that if that is all, then he will leave first. Gorangaran is moved, thinking that a heart that cares for those beneath him is truly the heart of a worthy knight. A short while later, inside a tavern, Gorangaran gathers everyone and asks them to listen carefully, saying that the protagonist was very generous with them because he distributed the money they earned from selling the villains' weapons, so they need to form a line and take their share. Everyone is surprised, and one of the mercenaries in the group asks whether he heard correctly, asking if the protagonist is really sharing all the money that should have been his with the entire group. They remain silent for a moment and then begin celebrating, shouting the protagonist's name. Meanwhile, at the inn, the protagonist is finally resting, but suddenly his door opens and someone tries to enter his room. On the night before the attack in the protagonist's room, Gorangoran was telling everyone that the protagonist had distributed the money from the sale of the villain's weapons. While everyone was celebrating, the protagonist simply thought that even though it was not much money, everyone was happy. In addition, he had taken all the silver coins, which are the most valuable, and still managed to gain some prestige, so he came out ahead. Suddenly, a man approaches him and asks whether he is Knight Johan. Johan is surprised and asks the man whether they happen to know each other. The old man says he knows him very well, because he is a noble who came with Lord Eldon's. For that reason, the man would like to take him to the best room, and all expenses have been paid by the Katana Trading Association, so he may enter. The protagonist thinks that apparently the merchant ended up giving him a reward in his own way, and since he is extremely tired, this is very good. He ends up agreeing with the man, asking him to take him to his room. Meanwhile, inside the tavern, Gamson is indignant, asking why he was the only one who did not receive anything. Goran explains that while everyone was fighting, he had been hiding, so he does not deserve any share. Gamson becomes irritated because he has been excluded, but suddenly he sees the protagonist soar through the window and comes up with a great plan. A short while later, already inside his room, the protagonist is relaxing in the hot bath. He enjoys the moment, saying that he will finally be able to rest in peace. A soft bed, a nice hot bath. He never imagined that such simple things could be such immense happiness for him. However, he had no idea that the life of a wanderer would be so harsh. Back then, he did not know how great the happiness of being able to sleep was, even if it was in an old, rotten bed. He thought life was difficult, but even so, he had been born into a noble family. But the mad emperor burned all his lands, and apparently he was not the only victim of this story, but even so, because he survived, perhaps he is in a better situation than the others. But as he thinks about this, he begins to wonder whether he should have accepted Karamav's offer. Because if things continue like this, he is certain to be captured by the Imperial Army, and in the end, of course, he will be executed. Because of that, he needs to think of another path. But now, stopping to reflect, the Imperial Army could not lay a single finger on Eldance. It makes no sense for a group of proud mercenaries to fear just one merchant, so it can only be because they have their eyes on the trading company Eldance belongs to. The protagonist remembers that when he was little, he learned about companies and trading associations in the village market. Associations within the same group share information and money across borders. If by chance the association is powerful, it can move politicians or nobles and even mobilize the army of an entire nation. And now that he is being pursued by the Empire, if he wants to survive, he needs to get close to a trading association no matter what. He decides to think about those more complicated things later since he is starving, so he needs to fill his stomach and sleep. In the middle of the night, while he is sleeping, the door to his room opens and someone enters trying to steal the sword. However, the protagonist grabs the thief's hand, saying that apparently he really does not get tired. With a frightening look, the protagonist asks him to answer whether he is one of Karamav's lackeys. But the bandit only tries to attack, telling him to let go of his hand immediately, but he's thrown into the door after being beaten. Johan holds the attacker's leg like a true monster. The attacker becomes frightened and screams, begging for forgiveness. The attacker realized far too late that the one he had messed with was a being beyond human. 5 minutes before the incident, inside the inn, the man responsible for the lodging was sleeping, so Gamson and another companion decided to invade the place. Gamson asks his new companion from the village whether they can really trust that guy inside. His new friend says yes, since Brother Bullen is extremely agile and strong. He also brought a dagger and a mask, and he will not be discovered. And just as Gamson had planned, Pell was probably already stealing the horses. Pell really was already in the stable, impressed by the protagonist's war horse because it looked very sturdy. The new companion asked Gamson whether the protagonist's sword really is that expensive. Gamson asks whether he has ever seen a sword that cuts a person in half with a single movement, because he saw that sword split the body of a fully armed soldier in two. A sword with that level of power cannot have an ordinary price. And even that knight, in the end, is probably nothing without a sword like that. As soon as they get close to the room, they realize that the great and unbeatable Bullen is being crushed. The protagonist drags him into the room like an animal, while the poor wretch screams for someone to save him. The young man from the village asks Gamson what is happening, but Gamson is completely in shock. He runs away, saying that he does not know what is happening, but if they want to survive, they need to run immediately. Gamson is still running desperately, thinking that now everything is over, because he can tell by instinct alone that something is very wrong. The innkeeper asks who he is and ends up recognizing the young man from the village, asking what they are up to now. Meanwhile, outside, Pell says that they finally arrived, but Gamson tells him to shut up and prepare to flee immediately. Pell is a little confused, asking what is happening and where Bullen is. Gamson says that guy is probably dead and that he needs to prepare to run, or he will die too. However, they start taking too long, and Gamson asks what they are doing because he already said they need to flee immediately, but Pell keeps asking where Bullen is. Gamson only shouts that noble will probably come after them, so they need to run immediately, but Pell points out that they cannot simply leave and abandon a companion. Suddenly, the room window shatters and the protagonist leaps out from inside like a demon. In the southern outskirts of the Holy Empire, some guards were putting up a sign. That sign said, "Warning, these individuals stole the property of a noble. According to the imperial edict, their crimes, as well as those of their families, are judged, and all will be punished at this location." The Emperor of the Holy Empire, Cardirian Bizalfurk. The guards look at the people being punished, and one of them asks what they stole to end up hanging there. Perhaps they took the seal of a noble family and fled. The other guard says he heard that they stole a chicken and 3 eggs from Baron Dvoržov's territory. The other guard is horrified because just for such a small theft, the entire family ended up like that. Meanwhile, still in the tavern, Eldans is calmly enjoying his meal. Suddenly, a person enters and says they have a small problem. Eldans asks what problem could possibly require them to interrupt his meal. The man says that Gamson, from the mercenary group, was caught trying to steal Knight Johan's luggage. This nearly makes the merchant die of fright. He stands up asking what really happened, because this is something very complicated since he wanted to get along well with that knight and accompany him to Marseille. Eldans tells them to tie up Gamson immediately and act as though they had nothing to do with it. The man ends up agreeing, but is impressed by his cold-bloodedness, because apparently that is the reaction of a merchant from the Katana Trading Company. The merchant tries to stay calm and thinks that, with all the experience he has, he will definitely be able to overcome this crisis too. After all, he does not need to die because of that. Even so, as a precaution, he needs to think of a way to deal with that noble if necessary. Meanwhile, somewhere else, the village chief ends the meeting he was holding regarding the village. But suddenly someone arrives and tells the village chief that they have a major problem because those delinquents were caught stealing a noble's belongings. This makes the village chief extremely irritated. The subordinate asks the village chief what they need to do. The village chief tells them to immediately gather tribute to offer the noble and also include one of the treasures that had been kept in the village. In addition, they need to prepare to execute the delinquents in front of the noble. However, 3 people become terrified since the delinquents were their sons. But the village chief grabs a chair and tells everyone to shut their mouths, asking whether they are such idiots that they have already forgotten the situation they are in, because apparently they cannot remember the emperor's edict. They need to act before that noble moves. Only then will the village be able to survive, because anyone who covets a man's property will have his tongue cut out, along with those of his direct relatives. Or perhaps it is hanging instead of the tongue. The village chief continues, saying that there are places where entire families have been exterminated because of this insane edict, simply because they asked for a chicken and 3 eggs as payment for overdue wages, because nobles have always been like that. He goes over to the relatives and asks how they think the noble whose sons tried to rob him will react now. After all, his honor has been wounded, so he will want to punish someone at any cost. And if it pleases the noble, he can order the entire village to be exterminated and wiped off the map because all of this is in the name of a gentleman's honor. One of the people points out that this is Count Yarpen's territory, and no matter how important that noble's family may be, if they ask the count for help, everything might be resolved. But the village chief says that nobles only care about their own little games of honor, asking whether they really think a count would care about the lives of a poor village like theirs. Because of that, they need to wake up and take action before it is too late. However, the delinquents' families are unable to act. The village chief also becomes upset, asking whether they really believe his heart is at peace. However, he does not know what else he can do. If those children do not die, the entire village may end up being exterminated. Because of that, he would like to apologize for having to do this to their sons, but it is a decision for the good of the entire village, so they need to accept it. After this long conversation, everyone is gathered beneath the central tree. The 4 delinquents are tied up and kneeling. The protagonist is also present, but he is not very comfortable since everything got out of control, because he thought they were assassins sent by the emperor. But in the end, they were just some village brats trying to steal a sword that looked expensive, and it was probably that flashy sword that caused all of this, so he needs to start being more careful. Besides, all of this is also partly his fault for walking around with something so conspicuous. Because of that, he only needs to give those brats a good scare so it will not happen again, and then let them go. The village chief goes over to the protagonist and treats him with all the respect in the world, asking how he is feeling. Johan, in an irritated tone, says, that it is very hard to say he is feeling well, since in Rudspec it seems they welcome guests by pointing knives at them while they sleep and greet them by stealing their belongings. The village chief kneels, begging 1,000 pardons, stressing that all of this is his fault for failing to control those idiots. The protagonist thinks that perhaps this scare has already been enough and tells the village chief to be more careful next time, dismissing everyone. The village chief grabs a short sword, saying that this is exactly why he himself will put an end to those delinquents to pay for all of this, in the name of a gentleman's honor. The protagonist thinks that this madman is making everything worse and tells him to stop immediately. But the village chief refuses, saying that those who damage a gentleman's honor deserve to die. Bulin begs Atanka not to do it and to spare him. The village chief apologizes and prepares to put an end to it. The boy's mother starts crying, saying that she is sorry for what happened. At that exact moment, the protagonist strikes his sword against the ground and asks whether he did not hear when he was ordered to stop. The murderous aura released by the protagonist makes the village chief and everyone else present begin trembling in fear. The protagonist shouts, asking whether they have gone mad because they're trying to eliminate people just because of a small misunderstanding. After all, if they truly want to pay for the crime, they can simply pay with money. Everyone, still frightened by that enormous murderous aura from before, just stands there, staring at him. The protagonist thinks that perhaps he was too direct. Johan tries to express himself better and asks since when honor has been worth more than a life. He orders the boys to be released immediately and tells them to leave. Atanka drops the short sword and, together with everyone in the village, kneels before the protagonist, saying that this is a truly honorable decision. The parents of the three run to their sons, relieved that they are all right. The village chief still cannot believe that a noble with such great benevolence could truly exist. And apparently what the merchant had said earlier was 100% true. The four delinquents also bow, thanking the protagonist and saying that they will never forget this kindness. They stress that they failed to recognize the protagonist's nobility and foolishly fell for the words of another fool, so they need to ask for his forgiveness once again. The parents scold their sons, saying that they should consider themselves extremely lucky, because if it had been any other noble, they probably would not have made it out of that alive. Gamson apparently had not learned anything from what had happened. He is still acting arrogantly and realizes that the mercenaries have finally appeared. He tells them to hurry up and release him from there. Irritated, he thinks that he should never have joined that unlucky band of mercenaries, and this time, he was caught. But next time, he definitely will. Gorankin grabs his head and tells him to relax his body because it will be better. Gamson is frightened and asks what he is doing, but before he can even finish the sentence, his life is taken. The protagonist sees this and is surprised. Gamson falls to the ground and the protagonist becomes furious, asking what Gorankin thinks he is doing. Gorankin points out that according to the imperial edict of the Holy Empire, those who covet a noble's property must be executed. Once again, the protagonist begins unconsciously leaking his murderous aura and says that apparently his words did not reach everyone's ears because he is certain he clearly said that he did not want to see those people's blood. The mercenaries and even the merchant are frightened by the aura, but Gorankin keeps his calm and his dignity as a true mercenary. He tells the protagonist that they also have their own honor and rules, which must be respected, and Gamson's wicked actions trampled on the honor and very life of the group as a whole. Because of that, he merely protected the honor and rules of the mercenary group. He picks up the short sword and hands it to the protagonist, saying that if he still considers this an affront to his authority, he may punish him, because he will bear all the consequences alone. The protagonist is surprised, but finally understands, because the mercenaries also have their own honor, and Gorankin is willing to stake his own life to defend it. The protagonist reaches for the short sword, frightening everyone, but pushes the weapon back, saying that, to be honest, he had not properly considered their position, so he would like to apologize properly. This makes everyone even more surprised, because a noble is apologizing and behaving properly, even towards someone who, theoretically, would not even be worthy of serving bread to a noble. The protagonist tells him to put away his dagger. Gorankin thanks him for his understanding. Goran asks what Gorankin was thinking when he did that, asking whether he has any idea how reckless it was to confront a noble like that. Gorankin, realizing the gravity of the problem, tells his friend that if he ever tries to do something like that again, then he can beat him up. Eldans is moved, thinking that this noble truly is different, honest, brave, and yet neither authoritarian nor abusive. So how can someone like that still exist? And if he introduces the protagonist to the trading company, his reputation will soar to the heavens. Because of that, he needs to do everything he can to keep the protagonist by his side. With everything resolved, the caravan continues on its way. The protagonist is holding the watch in his hand, saying that he chose that watch because he thought it was the most expensive item, but it is only a broken watch. In addition, he looks back and sees that now he has someone to take care of. A short while earlier, the village chief brought a slave and some belongings as a token of gratitude. The protagonist picked up the watch, asking whether it was really that valuable. Atanka is impressed, saying that he recognized it immediately, as expected of someone with the refinement of a noble. The village chief says that in addition to that gift, he could also take that slave, because despite his appearance, he understands geography well and could be very useful in the future. The protagonist thinks that he has never seen a slave in such poor condition, and that it could be dangerous for other slaves if he continued like that. Because of that, he accepts with gratitude. As they prepare to leave, he asks the village chief to let the slave take a bath and give him something to eat. The village chief tells Goiden to rejoice, because the honorable knight Johann has accepted him as a servant. The protagonist looks at his new servant and thinks that somehow he ended up accepting him, but having to personally command a slave makes him a little uncomfortable. During the night at the camp, the mercenaries are happy because they are eating meat and soup, all thanks to the money the protagonist had distributed to them. While the protagonist is resting, his new servant says that he has brought the meal. Johann thanks him for his kindness, but asks Goiden not to call him master, saying that he can call him by name. Goiden becomes embarrassed, but ends up accepting the suggestion. The protagonist looks at his new slave, not knowing whether he's a boy or a girl. The protagonist asks how someone good at geography ended up becoming a slave. Goiden says that it is not exactly a pleasant story, so he does not know whether it is worth hearing. Johann points out that he understands unpleasant stories very well. Goiden is surprised and asks whether his lord also went through terrible things, despite being a noble. Johann has no answer to that and decides to continue the conversation, saying that he would very much like to hear his new friend's story first. Goiden, even embarrassed, begins to tell him that originally he was someone who transported and sold weapons in the eastern region, a traveling merchant. He transported weapons and equipment made by blacksmiths to nearby villages, and then, at the request of a certain noble, began smuggling gold. The protagonist is surprised because that crime carries at least the death penalty, so he must have been very lucky to get out alive. However, he would like to know why an arms merchant would smuggle since Goiden seems very young. Goiden explains that he needed a lot of money to send to his family because his younger siblings were sick and starving, and because of that, he kept making deliveries with hidden gold as the noble had ordered, until one day, the noble himself reported him. The protagonist points out that after Goiden had been used enough, he was discarded in order to be silenced. Johann asks whether he tried to request a trial, but Goiden simply says no, because due to the imperial edict, he did not even have the right to speak. The protagonist becomes increasingly irritated with that idiot emperor and asks his servant whether he at least managed to send money to his siblings. Goiden starts crying, saying no, because in order to escape execution, almost everything he had was taken by the guards as a bribe. He tries to hide it, saying that some dust got into his eyes, but the protagonist says that he does not need to apologize in front of him and also does not need to hold back his tears. Johann feels disgust and a burning rage inside because that world is so filthy that apparently there is no salvation left. Without power, people are exploited as if they were criminals, and no one can stand up to the authority of the nobles. The private soldiers of the Brits family living through robbery, the people of Rutzbeck driven to sacrifice their own children, and even Goiden turned into a slave because of the whims of nobles. Because of this, he begins to question what is right, because all this injustice is heartbreaking. However, he quickly turns his mind back to the main point, because now is not the time to worry about other people's problems since he is being hunted by the Imperial Army and could die at any moment. Johann calls Goiden, saying that now that they have become companions, he cannot die, so they need to live together like family. Suddenly, one of the mercenaries runs up to the protagonist, saying that a monster has appeared nearby. Johann asks what kind of monster it is and complains that he does not have even a single second of rest. He runs out asking where it is, because he would like to face it. Goiden simply watches Johann, thinking about what he just said about living together. As soon as the protagonist arrives, he asks where the monster is. Goran says that it is too dark to see properly, but there is definitely a monster in there. The protagonist immediately realizes what it is and stands up, surprising the two of them, but says that everything is fine and asks them to put away their weapons. The two are surprised, and the protagonist says that he will go there alone. Goran asks Goran whether this is really all right, because no matter how brave a knight is, fighting monsters requires a specialized technique. Even luring them into a well-prepared trap is still extremely dangerous. Goran points out that unfortunately, their mission is to protect Eldens, and they cannot take such a high risk. But the protagonist already knew what it was, because he could feel that familiar pressure capable of freezing even the heart, with red eyes glowing in the dark. That is the great shadow wolf, the bad omen. The protagonist thinks that the last time they met, the shadow wolf attacked the wolves of Akaton as if it were trying to help him. It could charge forward in the blink of an eye and end the protagonist's life instantly, but for some reason, the protagonist feels that he will not be attacked. As soon as he approaches, he asks the wolf to stop hiding and come out. The wolf appears and comes closer, and the protagonist speaks sincerely, asking whether the wolf is following him and thanking it for the help it gave him last time. Goran cannot believe that Knight Johan even knows how to deal with monsters. Gorankin points out that he has also never seen anything like that in his entire life. The shadow wolf sniffs the protagonist and ends up biting his head, frightening everyone. But the protagonist tells the wolf to stop playing around and asks them not to be so scared, because this little guy is a harbinger of death. But the merchant says that it is the Guide of Dawn. The protagonist is surprised to hear that name. Eldans continues saying that in the Eastern Empire there is an ancient song. In the Age of Wars, on a night beneath the moonlight, a warrior gave a name to the wolf, and that name was Guide of Dawn. Upon receiving the name, the wolf lowered its head before the warrior. Blue eyes shone in the darkness. When they saw a wolf running ahead of the battlefield, everyone shouted. At the end of the war that tore the continent apart, the warrior achieved peace and died as a hero. By his side, for 3 days and 3 nights, the wolf cried, and its fur turned black. Then it set out on a journey to where order and heroes were needed. Johan asks whether the merchant is not confusing things, because that black wolf is known as the Shadow Wolf of Ill Omen. Eldan says that the Guide of Dawn originates from the legends of the Eastern Empire. When it reached the south, many details were lost. The Guide of Dawn punishes evil and submits to valiant heroes. And this is a passage from an ancient text of the Eastern Empire. The protagonist is surprised to discover that the wolf is actually that kind of being. The merchant gets excited and asks whether he can try touching that wolf. The protagonist says that he can try, but as soon as the merchant approaches, the wolf releases its frightening aura, leaving the poor man almost dead from fear. Eldan says that perhaps touching a beast is not the best option. Johan closes the wolf's mouth, saying that it is very mean and cannot go around eating the people around him. The merchant realizes that the wolf is only gentle with Knight Johan. Suddenly, he remembers that there was something like this in the legends of the Eastern Empire. It was said that by giving a name to a divine beast that follows you, it will become your servant. The merchant thinks that this southern bumpkin might actually be the legendary hero, but he does not believe that is possible. Though, if it is true, he needs to be careful. Eldans looks at the protagonist and asks whether, by any chance, he has given the Guide of Dawn a name. Johan says not yet. In truth, he had not had the opportunity before. The merchant suggests that he give it a name now, and if it is still really true, something incredible may happen. The protagonist becomes curious and tries to think of a good name to give that little guy. Eldan suggests Katana, but he is simply ignored. The protagonist remembers that the last time he had seen that little guy was when he buried that useless Karamav. And that is exactly when he realizes that the perfect name to give his new companion is Karamav. The merchant panics when he hears that name, but as soon as the protagonist names that beast, the wolf's eyes begin to shine. An incredibly powerful energy is released, making the entire area glow. The wolf, which previously had a red aura, begins to change color, transforming its power into blue. It truly is a Guide of Dawn, now named Karamav. The wolf approaches its new master and lowers its head. The protagonist is happy and pats the wolf's head, saying that he is counting on it. Johan says that Eldans really was right and that this is impressive, but as soon as he looks at the merchant, he realizes that he is kneeling, and the protagonist asks what is happening. Eldan says that everything happened exactly as in the legends, and that he never thought he would see a mythical scene right before his eyes. The merchant points out that he has admired the protagonist ever since the first time they met, because he protected everyone from thieves, granted mercy to his enemies with honor, and was chosen by a divine beast of the East. Therefore, he must salute the new hero of this chaotic era. Everyone is impressed to see that, in truth, the knight before them is the new and true hero of chaotic times. The protagonist takes a deep breath and apologizes, saying that unfortunately, he is not the kind of hero everyone is imagining. He's only a wanderer from an insignificant family, worried about surviving. He thinks that, on top of all that, he is being hunted by the Empire for eliminating the Holy Sword. Because of that, he would like to say that he is sorry for disappointing everyone. However, the merchant does not accept that and says that he would at least like to thank him somehow, suggesting that he introduce him to the Trading Association of Marseille. The protagonist, taking advantage of the situation, says that when they met, he heard the name of that city, but he had never heard what kind of place it was. Eldans begins to explain that Marseille is famous as a city of free trade. All the routes in that region pass through it, and above all, it is one of the few cities where the emperor's hand does not reach. This makes the protagonist even more excited to reach it and say that, in that case, he could not refuse the goodwill of a friend. He is happy because the Emperor's hand will not reach that place. On top of that, it is a commercial center, and maybe he can start over as a merchant. As they walk, the merchant continues singing the ancient song of the warrior's wolf. But the protagonist's only concern is that rumors about heroes, or something like that, might start spreading within the association. He thinks that being the hero of chaotic times would really be great if he were that hero. But whether in his past life or this one, he is still just someone who cannot even protect his own life. He remembers a warning the Sword Saint gave him, that he would only suffer from then on. However, either way, his life before death was not easy either, but this time will be different. In this life, he will move forward step by his own will. And so they set out for the city of wealthy merchants. As soon as he arrives in the city, he is impressed. Goiden is also happy because he never imagined he would be able to return to that place. The protagonist thinks that now that he has arrived in the city of merchants, the right thing to do is make a purchase first. Karamav, who had greatly reduced his size and hidden his extremely frightening aura, is barking at something, and the protagonist asks what he's doing. A woman starts playing with the dog, saying he is very cute, and asks whether he would like to try something there. The protagonist realizes that in other people's eyes, that dog looks like nothing more than an adorable puppy, even though he is an extremely powerful divine beast. One day before entering the city, they had been trying to figure out how they would enter with the Shadow Wolf. Johan explains to Karamav that a small puppy would be discreet, but a monster like him entering the city would cause complete chaos, so he should wait outside. Karamov decides to solve that problem and begins shrinking his size and hiding all his power, transforming into a small puppy. The protagonist is surprised, asking whether that is also an ability of a divine beast. Goiden holds Karamov, saying that he looks very cute that way. The protagonist agrees, saying that at that size he probably will not cause any major problems. However, even though he does not cause problems, he still attracts a lot of attention. Several people are impressed by the beauty of that animal. The protagonist thinks that drawing so much attention probably will not be good for them, so they need to leave that place quickly since they are still being hunted. Goiden asks Johan to buy a large bag to carry luggage, as well as oil and vinegar, saying that from then on, he will take care of all the equipment. Johan remembers that he was an arms merchant, so he can probably handle these things well. However, he shows that he only has 4 silver coins, asking whether they can really buy all of that. Goiden takes only 1 coin, saying that he will sort things out with someone else. Johan laughs, telling him not to push himself too hard while thinking about what could possibly be done with only 1 silver coin. 50 minutes later, Goiden returns with several items, saying that this is already more than enough. This leaves Johan surprised, because he never imagined that his servant could really handle everything with only 1 coin. First, they bought a small tactical bag for the protagonist, and right after that, a large supply backpack for Goiden. That way, it will be much easier to store things. As for the completely broken helmet, Goiden managed to use his absurd gift of gab to sell it for a very high price, and even got a Morning Star as a bonus. Now he no longer needs to use the Crest Recoverer. In addition, they managed to buy vinegar and oil to preserve the weapons, other assorted supplies, and still received a few copper coins as change. Strangely, after buying all of that, something surprising happened. Their initial balance was only 4 silver coins, and they spent 1 silver coin, but the profit was 9 silver coins, leaving them with a final balance of 12 silver coins and 10 copper coins. And if even a completely destroyed helmet sold for that price, he can barely imagine how much the equipment he buried from the former Karamov is worth. And if he ever goes back there, he will dig it all up and sell it for a great price. Johan says that Goiden seems very happy doing something he knows well, and that is to be expected, because being a merchant suits him very well. Goiden says that he truly missed that life because he lived as a slave without knowing when he would die, and every day was filled with despair and fear. But now, after meeting the protagonist, he no longer has that. It feels as if he has returned to the life he had when he was a merchant, so he would very much like to thank him. And even if he were not a slave, he still would have chosen to follow the protagonist without hesitation. Johan says that he is very happy to hear that, so from now on they will count on each other. Goiden is happy, feeling that he finally has a family again. With everything settled, the two begin enjoying the city. After so much suffering, the protagonist finally arrives in the great commercial city of Marseille. There, he begins experiencing a happiness impossible to compare with the life of a wanderer. He tries a piece of meat and thinks that the dried meat he ate while traveling felt like shoe leather, while the meat in that city is tender and melts in his mouth. When he was wandering, he could not even bathe and lived constantly itching, but now he can bathe in hot water whenever he wants. Before, during his journey, he did not have a proper place to sleep, lying only on cold, damp stones that poked his entire body. But now he can sleep under warm, fluffy blankets, so life in that place is perfect, and he has already made up his mind because he will settle down there and live there forever. But despite his happy dream, fate did not follow his will. The next day in the central square, the protagonist is once again enjoying his peace, because it has been a long time since he has walked around so calmly. Suddenly, he hears some people commenting that this is very worrying, because another group of thieves has appeared again, and this time, it was Lord Dave's daughter, and they even took all the goods. They do not know what kind of news they will hear tomorrow, because, with those thieves on the loose, they cannot live peacefully. Goiden becomes worried, saying that apparently there are thieves even around the city, and the atmosphere is getting strange. The protagonist hears a man arguing with a vendor, saying that he will pay later because he has not eaten anything in 4 days. That man was a remaining soldier from the wolves of Akaton Mercenary Company. While they were pursuing the protagonist, he ended up getting separated from the main body and, wandering around to survive, eventually ended up in Marseille. Suddenly, the soldier and the protagonist exchange glances. The soldier, without thinking twice, grabs his sword and charges forward. Johan is surprised, seeing that those pieces of trash followed him all the way there, and this will not be good, because if he fights in that place, he will draw a lot of attention. However, the soldier does not think twice and charges forward, but before he can make any move, he is eliminated. A man on horseback says that he thought it was a bandit, but it was only an ordinary robber. But with the city's security so unstable, all kinds of people keep appearing. He looks at the protagonist and calls him a traveler, asking whether they suffered any harm. Goiden thanks him for his help and says that everything is fine. Johan simply remains silent, trying to understand exactly what just happened there. The guard smiles and says that he is glad he arrived in time and asks them to always stay alert. He rides off on his horse and calls out to all the citizens of the city. Once everyone is gathered, he asks them not to worry. He is Bradil, the commander of the Oak Mercenary Company. Bradil continues saying that with those 500 men of the Oak Company, they will completely eradicate the bandits and thieves and restore safety to the city. Goiden is impressed and says that it is incredible to see them in person. The protagonist asks whether those people are famous. Goiden says yes, because the Oak Company is one of the most renowned mercenary companies in the Empire. In addition, he heard that there are thieves around the city, so they must have been hired to deal with that. However, the only thing the protagonist is thinking is that if that man had not helped earlier, his identity would probably have been exposed, and if that happened, he would be pursued by the Empire again and would no longer be able to remain in that city. This makes him think once again about the phrase that he would always suffer from that point on. He begins scolding himself, saying that he needs to wake up because he is still a fugitive, and the only way to survive is to build a good relationship with the Katana Company. Not even the Empire dares to mess with a major mercantile company. Luckily, Eldan saw him in a good light and managed to get him a chance to connect with the company in Marseille. However, if his identity is revealed before that, he does not know whether the mercantile company would protect him, knowing that he is being pursued by the Empire. This means that if his identity is exposed before he earns Katana's trust, he will die without any connections. Because of that, his new objective is very clear. He needs to find the Katana Company and secure protection against the Empire. Therefore, until he gains their trust, his identity must never come to light. But at that very moment, someone asks whether the protagonist is the knight named Johan. She introduces herself, saying that she is an exclusive maid of the Katana Company and that her name is Ibelka. She says that she heard very impressive reports about his deeds through Lord Eldon's, so they would like to create a deep bond with the protagonist or with his house. If it pleases him, he may accompany her to the Katana Company. A short while later at the Katana Trading Company, Marcel Branch, Goiden, is trying to teach Karamav to behave better. Meanwhile, the protagonist is already inside a room, waiting. He thinks that he has finally managed to reach the company, and that place may be his chance to change his life. So all that remains is to hope the conversation goes very well. Suddenly, another person arrives asking whether the protagonist is Knight Johan, because she has heard many stories about him through Eldon's. She introduces herself, saying that she is the manager of the Marcel branch of the Katana Company, and that her name is Iaan. The protagonist becomes excited and also introduces himself, saying that it is a pleasure to meet her. Iaan suggests that the two talk a little while drinking tea, and the protagonist agrees, saying that this is a great idea. She presents the tea, saying that it is a trade product from the Mediterranean region. Because of that, she hopes he enjoys the taste of the tea. The protagonist holds the cup and thinks that it is coffee, then thanks her, saying that he will try a little. He says that the aroma is excellent, a drink made from roasted seeds. She is pleased, saying that is exactly right, and praises him, saying that he is very perceptive. It is rare for someone to recognize it immediately, but now that he has tasted a little of the tea, they can move on to the main subject. She says that she can already imagine the reason for his visit to that place, which frightens the protagonist. He wonders whether it is possible that they have already discovered that he is wanted by the Emperor. Ion takes a deep breath and says, that is exactly it. The protagonist is there because he carries ambition in his heart. This surprises him even more, but she continues saying that this is exactly what she heard from Eldance. The protagonist protected the innocent and showed mercy even to enemies who surrendered. Someone like that visiting Marseille, a city plagued by bands of thieves, means only one thing. So they were able to see in it the ambition to save that city with his own hands. The protagonist thinks that he does not know exactly what that woman is talking about, but either way, it is better to simply agree. He laughs and says that apparently they managed to see through all his thoughts. Ion says that ambition is not a bad thing. On the contrary, it is a virtue of those who are qualified. And to be honest, she says that their company likes to sponsor the ambition of qualified people. The protagonist becomes excited, thinking that now the conversation is flowing because this is probably a business proposal. Ion says that if the protagonist wishes, they can even introduce him to the governor of Marseille. The protagonist is impressed because the governor is practically the mayor of the city, and not only the company, but even the local governor is on his side. If it reaches that point, not even the old emperor will be able to touch him easily, which makes this proposal basically impossible to refuse. The protagonist thanks her for the offer, but says he would like her to explain the details a little more, what exactly the company's sponsorship means. Ion explains that the company's sponsorship means having access to all the services they offer. Restaurants, inns, and even entertainment can all be enjoyed in Katana's name. Of course, there are some limitations. If he goes too far and causes some kind of loss, the sponsorship may be withdrawn. In addition, she says there is only one condition. When they need him, the protagonist must fight under the company's banner. Johan asks whether the company wants him to deal with the bandits threatening the city. Ion explains that they do not because that task has already been taken on by the Oak Company, and they would like the protagonist to do other things. Johan is surprised and asks what those things would be. Ion simply laughs and says that recently, some merchants have begun harboring resentment toward them, saying that Katana monopolizes the market. The more those complaints grow, the more difficult things become for the company. So they want the protagonist to eliminate all the dissatisfied merchants, preferably along with their children. That is the only condition. After explaining everything, she asks whether he will still accept the proposal. Johan simply remains silent, staring at her for a moment. Right after the conversation ends, he goes to meet Goiden. His servant asks whether the conversation with the company went well, but the protagonist keeps a stern expression, which frightens the little boy. But suddenly, Johan starts shouting, saying that now they can go suck honey. Goiden is a little confused, asking what sucking honey means. 1 hour earlier, Johan had refused that proposal without thinking twice. He points out that in a metropolis like that, with a distribution monopoly, it is natural for complaints to arise. But solving that with assassination, especially involving children, is something he does not agree with, since he cannot kill innocents for no reason, so he will not do it. He says it would be better for the two of them to pretend that proposal never existed. Ion keeps a serious face, staring at the protagonist, but he does not back down a single millimeter from his words. She begins to laugh and says that he passed. Johan is surprised because he did not expect that to be a test. Ion explains that they were merely testing whether he was truly worthy of receiving the company's support, and since he demonstrated that he is a righteous knight, they would like to apologize for their discourtesy. The protagonist asks about the monopoly and the merchant's complaints. Ion says that the Katana Company has never monopolized the market, nor caused dissatisfaction among the merchants. That is very far from the truth because they sell quality products at fair prices. This gives them an excellent reputation since there are many guilds that bribe and favor one another. In addition, they would like to maintain the condition proposed by the protagonist himself, but they do not expect him to enter combat immediately. The Oak Company has already set out to subdue the thieves, so in the meantime, the protagonist can simply enjoy the company's support and rest as much as he wants. With this new proposal, and after everything is explained in detail, she extends her hand and asks whether he accepts the agreement. Johan laughs and accepts without thinking twice. And, under the protection of St. Luac, that meeting will bring great benefits to both sides. Returning to the present, Goiden still does not know what sucking honey means. The protagonist explains that sucking honey basically means going out to eat expensive things, and all of it will be paid for with the company's money. Goiden is happy to see that the conversation apparently went very well. The protagonist says that he literally managed to secure the support of a major company. His servant congratulates him, and the protagonist thanks him for his kindness. Johan thinks that receiving the guild's support right after arriving in the city is going far too well. And even though the thieves are still causing problems, once the Oak Company deals with them, the city will soon return to peace. And the life he has dreamed of so much is right in front of him. Now he can relax and enjoy himself a little. But while he is walking through the city, he hears screams. When he looks, some people are lying lifeless on the ground, all because the thieves attacked again. He starts wondering why there are corpses in a place like that. Garangaran sees the protagonist and asks whether he was there. Johan, still not fully understanding what happened, asks his companion whether he saw what all of that was. Garangaran explains that, unfortunately, the thieves around the city are becoming more and more violent. They are attacking merchants' family members and leaving the bodies like that as a threat to the entire city. Suddenly, someone in the crowd starts shouting, saying that this is solving nothing and that the bandits are becoming more aggressive, so they need to hold the city responsible. Another man says that he heard it is the emperor himself who is inciting those thieves. This causes an argument among the people, as some say that all of it is absurd, because the emperor would not do that unless he had gone mad. The argument grows worse and worse, and the entire population starts getting caught up in the commotion. This irritates the protagonist, because his city, which was finally becoming peaceful, is once again being ruined because of thieves, and he has no idea what the mercenaries are doing to deal with this situation. Ibelka goes to Ion's office saying that they have a serious problem. Ion says that if it is about the bodies sent by the thieves, she has already seen them and asks what the Oak Company is doing about it. Ibelka explains that actually this is the problem. They have been unable to contact the Oak Company. Ion is startled and asks what is happening. The subordinate explains that the previous day they found the bodies of a messenger in the forest near the city in a terrible state. Ion becomes more concerned because the Oak Company has military strength comparable to a fortress, being one of the largest companies in the empire, and it would not fall to a simple band of thieves. She asks Ibelka to immediately bring Sweaterg, the mage of the Ipal River, because they need his prophecy to confirm whether they were truly defeated. At the Ipal River, Sweaterg is laughing, saying that the Katana Company made a huge mistake, because no matter how much they search for knights, nothing will change. The protagonist killed the Emperor's hound and fled, and now he is trying to hide inside Marcel's money pouch, but things will not go as he is planning. Sometime later at the branch, Sweeterg appears. Ibelka welcomes him, saying that the company is immensely grateful that he answered their call. Sweeterg becomes irritated, saying that he does not want thanks, because they sent a terrible driver for the carriage and his spine is nearly splitting in half. Ibelka apologizes for the inconvenience and says she will call the person in charge immediately. Sweeterg says there is no need, because if it really is urgent, she will find a way to hear it herself. Ibelka tries to argue, but the mage interrupts, telling her not to make him repeat himself. They go to a private room and the mage begins saying that according to the voice of the Ipal River, it told him that the mage could find him inside. Meanwhile, the protagonist is outside, cheerful, because the day has finally come to meet the governor of that city. He prepares for the meeting, saying that he needs to get along very well with him no matter what in order to stabilize himself a little better in that city and put an end to that life of a wanderer pursued by the empire. As he is heading to the meeting, he starts wondering what the governor might like, because he should have asked that beforehand, but before they enter, Karamov becomes agitated and Johan asks what is happening. But the mage hears the dog's name and says, that name does not suit a divine beast. Johan becomes alert, wondering how that old man knows Karamov is a divine beast. The protagonist asks the old man who he is. Sweaterg introduces himself, saying that he is the sage of the Ipal River, or a mage if he prefers. The protagonist is surprised and thinks that this should have been a little obvious, because in another world, of course, magic should exist. This makes him even happier, because he went there to meet the governor and ended up meeting a mage. And a big city really is amazing. Johan is so excited that he quickly approaches the mage, saying that it is a pleasure to meet him, because he has always wanted to meet a mage. Sweeterg is flattered but tells the protagonist that for someone being hunted by the emperor, he seems quite comfortable. Johan is shocked by that statement and asks how the mage knows about it. Sweeterg says it is simply magic and the mystery of the river. Through it, he can see the past and the future. Johan asks whether the old man is going to report him to the emperor, but the mage asks why he would do something like that, asking who the protagonist thinks he is, because he is someone who knows the secrets of the Ipale River and someone who studies the mysteries within the laws of nature. Worldly political disputes do not interest him in the slightest. In addition, he is moved only by the voice of the river. If he truly wanted to report the protagonist, he would have to do it secretly, since he would not dare pick a fight with someone so recklessly. Johan ends up agreeing and thinks that this makes a lot of sense. Sweaterg is still surprised because, in his mind, someone as strong as the protagonist and a knight like him would normally say that mages are proper cowards who know nothing about the honor of battle, but instead of that reaction, the protagonist's eyes were shining whenever he talked about magic. Johan continues showing all his excitement and asks the mage how someone learns to use magic and whether an ordinary person could also use it. He thinks that this is his big chance, a chance to learn magic and become a magic swordsman, which would drastically increase his chances of survival. Sweeterk ends up being moved by all that enthusiasm and says that since this too is fate, there is no harm in teaching him. However, simply talking about it would be very boring, and if the protagonist can win a round in a betting game against him, then he will teach him. Johan asks whether this betting game is something like chess, and asks whether there are no other options, such as arm wrestling. Suiderg laughs, saying that arm wrestling would be unfair since one of them possesses frightening strength. Besides, it is not chess either, so he asks the protagonist to follow him. As they walk, the mage explains that the game of kings is very fun, but it does not come close to the game of gods. Sweeterg places a board on the table along with two other things. The protagonist recognizes the game immediately because it is Go. The mage asks the protagonist to sit down and asks whether he thinks it looks complicated, telling him not to worry too much, because he will go easy on him while they play. Johan thinks that luck is on his side once again, because if it is the same game, then, incredibly enough, he once won a competition in the army, so he is very confident, and even without knowing how good his opponent really is, he will still win. The mage says they need to start calmly, but the protagonist is very confident and thinks that he will definitely win. Before making the first move, he thinks that besides managing to win, he will also gain magical knowledge, so he is very lucky. 50 minutes later, the two are still playing, but the protagonist is already bothered. However, the mage tells them to play just one more time, but the protagonist disagrees, saying that the mage has already asked that 5 times. Sweeter gets angry, saying that this is far too exaggerated because it makes no sense for him to have lost the game of gods. He asks the protagonist whether this is really his first time playing it, because not even the Sultan of the Eastern Empire managed to defeat him. Johan praises the mage, saying that his teachings were very effective, so he was able to learn quickly. Sweeterg insists on playing just one more time, saying that if he loses this time, he will give the protagonist a gift that will be useful for his entire life. Johan becomes curious, because a gift from a mage is possibly some magical item. Because of that, he ends up agreeing to play one more time and asks how many stones the mage wants as a handicap. Sweeterg is a little awkward but decides to choose only 3. While they are playing, the mage asks why someone born a noble is so interested in magic. Johan points out that he is being hunted by the emperor, so it is better to know how to do anything that can increase his chances. Sweeterg says that if the protagonist is thinking of using magic in combat, he can give up now, because the magical knowledge he is thinking of teaching is not that kind of thing. Johan is surprised and a little irritated, asking whether magic really cannot be used in battle. The mage is surprised, asking whether he was really thinking about that. Sweeterg had already agreed to answer, so he tells him something, saying that there really are people who use magic in combat. Johan laughs and says that apparently it really does exist, but the mage scolds him, saying that he must not take it as a joke. After all, the people generally called mages are those who discover mystery within nature itself. Some find it in the wind, others in fire. Some discover it in sulfurous vapor, in the flames of sulfur. And there is an idiot out there who claims to have found mystery in the Black Forest. The protagonist thinks that there was extra emotion in that last sentence that the others did not have. Sweeterg explains that these discovered mysteries are called spirits. Mages merely borrow the power of those spirits. Normally, spirits grant their power without demanding anything, but their fickleness sometimes exacts a very high price. Because of that, even if the protagonist finds a mystery, he must never go against the will of a spirit. The protagonist thinks that this is the kind of world where it does not seem worth betting one's life to study the laws of nature. And apparently, he will not become a magic swordsman or receive a magical item. Suddenly, Ibelka and Eon come running in. Eon asks why she was not informed earlier. Ibelka explains that it was because the mage had truly threatened her not to tell. Ion says that mages are all like that because she had already said it was urgent. As soon as she enters the room, she notices a tense atmosphere between the protagonist and the mage. She realizes that once again that old mage is tormenting someone with the game of gods. However, this time is different. She is surprised to see Sweeterg begging to play just one more time. Ion cannot believe that grumpy old man is losing at the game of gods, which makes her wonder what kind of person the protagonist really is. She interrupts the game, saying that she has finally found him, and says that since he came to the city, he should have called her first, asking whether he was having some fun with the protagonist. Sweeterg laughs because he was merely playing a few matches with that knight. He says that now that the manager has arrived, it is a shame, but they need to end the game there. but the protagonist holds one of the pieces, staring fixedly at the mage. Sweeterg says that he understands and places two potions on the table. The protagonist asks what they are. Sweeterg says that he had already promised, because that is the final truth of the Ipale River sealed inside those bottles. They are called the Water of Wrath and the Water of Blessing. At the Oak Mercenary Company's outpost, the atmosphere is strange. Bradil is startled, asking what that is. A completely strange being with a frightening aura begins approaching them. Bradil realizes that this cannot be the work of bandits, but before they can do anything, they are all attacked. Meanwhile, at the branch, the protagonist is still surprised by the gift he received. The mage explains that since ancient times, the Ipale River has guarded a deep secret, the mystery of life and death. He spent his entire life trying to unravel that secret, but the river never gave him the answers. Until the protagonist appeared. He says that as long as the head is not completely decapitated, the bottle of red water is capable of healing any wound, no matter how severe. As for the green bottle, a single drop is enough to melt an entire person. Guys, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like, comment, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new content. Thank you.